Probably me. Welcome to the Planning Commission meeting of February, what is this? 19th. We're starting the meeting right now, and we are going to start with the pledge. Commissioner Reese, would you lead us in the pledge, please? Can you see me? That's okay. I'll be fine.
Yes.
I could be a short person tonight. That's okay. I can, if I knew. Yeah. But hi. Can you see me? Can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Here.
Commissioner Fresco.
Here.
Commissioner McKinnon.
Present.
Commissioner Landris.
Here.
Commissioner Pastor.
Here.
Commissioner Reese. Here. Chair Lambert.
Here. Can we have the planning director's report, please?
Good evening, Commission. Coming up at your next meeting on March 4th, it's a special meeting. It will be held at the Ken Edwards Center. So again, it's not here, it's at Ken Edwards. On that agenda, we have 411 Ocean Park Boulevard, which is a variance, fence wall, hedge modification, and major modification. We also have the 2019 legislative session zoning amendments and food hall zoning amendment. So that's all on the 4th. On the 18th, we're back here in the East Wing. We have a project at 1448 7th Street, which is a development review and map for a mixed-use project. April 1st, again here in the East Wing, 1643 Euclid Street, which is a development review permit for an office project. 1820 Broadway is a CUP for a gym and creative use. And then we will bring the SB 743 threshold adoption to the Commission. Then on April 15th, at that point, we're back in the council chambers, 1448 7th Street, which is a DR and map for a mixed-use project. Actually, we have that on here twice. It's on March 18th and April 15th. So it's one of them, okay. We'll let you know exactly when that's coming. And then upcoming for City Council, February 25th, is the urgency IZO to allow fire stations in the open space zone at the beach. And then on March 10th, there is a landmarks appeal going to council for 1531 Georgina Avenue, the loose process threshold urgency IZO, as well as clarification for use of existing housing stock. And that concludes my report.
Thank you. Are there questions of staff? Okay, moving right along. The next item is a presentation by Jeng, which is an update on the housing policy work plan.
Evening, Commission. So what we wanted to do is set the stage for quite a bit of work to come. That we were last with you in November, and since then we had a study session with the City Council about how we're proceeding and getting direction on the housing policy work plan. So tonight, we'll give you kind of a development update where we're at as of the last time we met with respect to compliance with fifth cycle arena, progress update on the arena, what we're doing to prepare for the housing element, review of council's direction from December, and then an overview for you of how we're prioritizing the work plan and everything that's involved in it, just so you have a sense of what is coming forward over the next year to 18 months. So development update, you can see here, this is the, as of October or November, I think it is actually, for compliance with RENA. So, similar to last time, we are meeting, all of our targets with respect to extremely low, very low, and above moderate. But in the low and moderate income category, we're still a little bit short. We do have some projects that are coming forward that will be pulling permits within the time frame. So, we'll probably be fine on those numbers by the time the reporting period on the fifth cycle ends. Since November 20th to now, we have received 2 more applications for mixed-use housing projects, 100% affordable housing, you can see there, and a relatively small 10-unit project. There are a few other ones that, kind of in the works that may be coming forward, we expect in the next few months. What's going on with the RENA process? So last we talked, it was with HCD for that 60-day review period. That period is now finished, handed back to SCAG. So what's next is Monday. There is the RENA subcommittee meeting. Essentially, HCD signed off on the recommended methodology that SCAG Regional Council had voted on. So that will be a recommendation on the final methodology from the RENA subcommittee. The SCAG Regional Council will vote on that on March the 5th. So that's the methodology that will be voted upon. And then April 2nd, they will be reviewing the draft allocation, so the actual numbers based on the adopted methodology. The numbers that we've been providing to you have been produced by SCAG staff as part of an estimate tool that's online. So until the whole thing is finalized and they crunch the numbers, the number could shift every so often. And in fact, it actually has. Ours is now down to 8,800, so yay, I guess. From 9,000, we're still at 69% affordable. So that's a number that we expect to probably just shift a little bit, until the process is actually finalized in October. When we actually get this is the final number, that's not going to change. I wanted to note there have been some questions about appeals procedures or what that looks like. So in early April, that will be the start of the RENA appeal filing period. Just to give you an overview of what that procedure looks like, who can appeal? It has to be the jurisdiction, so it would be the legislative body, so City Council would have to decide to file that appeal. Other cities, can file appeals, and HCD. So those are the only 3 entities that can file an appeal. Nobody else is eligible to do that. And the appeal cannot be based on, the local ordinance that somehow, doesn't allow housing or what have you. It cannot be based, and in 2 new provisions, it cannot be based on historic underproduction, based on prior arenas. So, they will not accept the fact that our numbers were way lower before, so it should be lower now. That's not a basis for it, and nor is stable population growth. You can see here the sort of basic process that SCAG has released in terms of the appeal procedure. So the filing period is April-May for a period of 45 days. There's a 45-day comment period, and then there's public hearings over 30 days in July. So that's kind of how the appeals procedure is set out. 6th cycle RENA, so that is the cycle that is coming up ahead of us, 2021 to 2029. Again, anticipating that much larger allocation than we have had in prior years. As I indicated, the revised estimate based on the adopted methodology is now 8874, so it's come down a little bit from that over 9,000 number. However, as you know, there's 69% are still affordable, so at that very low and moderate income category. You can see the numbers there on the screen in terms of totals at each category, or the estimates as they are right now. We also included, just to provide a little bit of context as to what it means in terms of Santa Monica's average production. So in that 2014 to 18 year, which is the data that we have from the APRs we've been submitting for this last cycle, you can see in the very low income category, we 52 on average a year. We just multiplied it by 8, just to give you a sense of what would occur typically over an 8-year period. So you're looking at hundreds of units versus thousands of units that are being allocated. These are units that are building permits are being issued for. So that just gives some context. In terms of the housing element, which is what this is leading towards ultimately, the schedule for that is the deadline for certification is October 15th, 2021. There is a 120-day grace period. So, in actuality, if we needed a little bit of time to shore things up or what have you, you do have until February 12th of 2022 to have that element finally certified by HCD. It does include a pretty robust public engagement process that we're still working through, but it will include all affected stakeholders from tenants and landlords who experience housing providers, the development community that's constructing it, city boards and commissions that have an interest in this work, and the service providers that deal with housing as well. So that is definitely something that we are anticipating as part of the housing element preparation. In terms of the schedule, this is just a sort of very high-level schedule. So we are going to have to prepare an EIR, given the number of units that are being programmed in this housing element update and the housing element itself. So the EIR, essentially needs to get started actually pretty soon in order for us to make it. We anticipate turning in a public review draft around Q2 of 2021, which will trigger the 60-day review period by HCD. And then what happens is that it comes back to us for our city council to adopt. And we anticipate that occurring in Q3. We did ask HCD, just kind of, wondering when do permits, which permits count towards which cycle, like when's the cutoff date. We got back kind of, I think they're still working that out. So they anticipated there may be a period between July and October that permits or units, count towards both cycles. So we'll see what happens out of that. I'm sure we'll get more clarity, as that time period comes closer. But you can see that's kind of like a very high-level overall schedule of the phases of like preparing the housing element, having a public review draft out there submitted to HCD, coming back to the city for adoption, and then giving it back to HCD for that 90-day review period until you have a formally certified element. That's how we were working back to having something to HCD by Q2. So I'll talk about sort of like the broader work plan and how that impacts us in the coming slides. Just to give you a big picture overview, what does a housing element include? It has to include these 5 major components, which is an evaluation of progress in measuring your housing production relative to your RENA allocation for the last cycle. So it will include that. It will include a needs assessment based on the city's demographics, household characteristics, and what have you. It's kind of assessing our community needs for housing. It will also assess constraints, on housing production as well. And then kind of the part that you've heard us talk a lot about, which is the suitable sites inventory, because new laws in 2017 kind of changed the rules a little bit, for how that is going to be implemented. The purpose of that is to identify adequate sites for residential development. So we're not guaranteeing, that housing is going to be built. Our job is simply to establish the parameters to accommodate the allocation that is given to us. The rest is sort of up to people to actually produce that housing and build that housing. There was a new law also as part of the 2017 package, SB 166, which established a no net loss requirement for the life of the entire housing element. For that 8-year cycle, you have to demonstrate that your land inventory is accommodating that allocation. Guidance from HCD suggests that we should be planning for actually 10 to 15% above our allocation to give us flexibility in the event that a housing project is approved with lower density than we anticipated or accounted for in the inventory. It sets off a series of events in terms of finding replacement units for that project that was approved below the density. So that's why they're sort of saying, establish some wiggle room early on to give yourself to not have that fire drill when that happens. And then the final part of the housing element is the goals, policies, and implementation. So this is essentially the city's work program on how we implement the housing element actions and program and implementation. So what we anticipate the key issues will be, as I indicated, that suitable sites inventory is effectively, an entire citywide build out assessment of where development is likely to occur. We have to consider that no net loss law, that is now in place. And finally, we have the CEQA analysis, that needs to run concurrent with this. It's not something that we had anticipated, when we were looking at this sort of a year and a half ago in the prior housing elements. Typically, because the allocations were within what we had analyzed in our general plan, we could just tear off of that. But in this case, we're having to do a brand new EIR. This is way more housing units than we ever anticipated in the loose and DCP combined. So what are we doing to prepare for this at the moment? The RFQ for a housing element consultant, the deadline for that has closed at this point, and we have interviews scheduled for respondents to that RFQ. So we're really looking to get that process underway and get somebody under contract as soon as possible. We are applying for a LEAP grant, which stands for Local Early Action Planning Grant. This was something that was programmed in the 2019 legislative session, and we have a maximum of $300,000 available to us for the preparation of the sixth cycle element. We are asking for a budget enhancement to cover that, because obviously that's not going to come anywhere near covering the cost of the EIR and the housing element. So, we are moving forward with that grant. It looks to be like it's similar to an SB2 process, so if we apply, I think we expect that we'll be getting that. And we're also starting to coordinate with Housing Division, other city departments that collect data on housing in preparation for a joint database for monitoring housing development sort of in a single place. Over the years, it'll become pretty key to ensure that we're compliant with the housing element over the life of that sixth cycle. I don't think we ever kind of provided for you a comprehensive review of the council's direction from December, so I thought it'd be helpful just to provide that to you, as it's providing context for the actions that staff is taking at the moment and the timing of how we're prioritizing things. So when council had their study session in December, pretty clear to us, they said the challenge ahead is to accommodate this 69% of our allocation as affordable housing. So, and I think generally speaking, we heard the sentiment from the council was that there was not the intent to appeal the RENA. It was sort of roll up our sleeves and see, how we can do this. So out of this came sort of like four major themes from council's direction. One was to support 100% affordable housing. Secondly was to activate the density bonus. Third was to incentivize housing on Bergamot and the boulevards. And fourth was to retain existing housing stock. So I'll just sort of talk briefly about each of those key areas. Within the 100% affordable housing, there was really, I think across the board we heard, that we need to remove barriers to the production of 100% affordable housing, given the very high percentage of our allocation that is dedicated to affordable housing. So, as you're looking tonight, one of the first steps is sort of streamlining the process for that. State law has certainly provided some incentives in terms of density and height, bonuses for affordable housing. And the council also asked us to look at, how can we reduce city costs, remove costs as a barrier, whether it's offsite improvements or different fees here and there that, can be an unknown and be a barrier for the production of affordable housing. The other part that council also talked about, and I think the Planning Commission picked up on this as well, was, this is a very big number, and it's more than, any one local jurisdiction, can reasonably bear. And, so this idea of, seeking legislative changes or finding funding, lobbying the state, as SB 5 was vetoed by the governor, and work to bring something like that back. That there's an understanding that if the expectation is that we're meeting these housing goals, that there needs to be support, from the state to do this work. So that's something that council is pursuing, and certainly directed staff to seek legislative changes in that regard. There was interest in having an inventory of public land, and maybe consider that for affordable housing that there's the opportunity for them to have right of first refusal on that property. So these were ideas that were put out there on how we could accommodate this. And then there was also the interest in ensuring the availability of those units for existing families and residents of Santa Monica. In terms of the density bonus, implementing AB 1763, which is something that Planning Department has already done. So for 100% affordable housing, they are able to exercise the provisions of that state density bonus law. For market rate projects, I'll talk through that work program. It's a little bit trickier because of the implications of, we really don't have a maximum density. And so there's, many different ways that program could be implemented. So we are working through that in phases as part of our work program. For the incentivization of housing production in Bergamot and the boulevards, so I think we definitely heard from council an interest in, being consistent with the loose growth strategy that, that new development occur in downtown Bergamot Boulevards, the areas closest to high-frequency transit, and continue to make sure that we try and, retain our residential neighborhoods, and to ensure that, that housing stock is protected. So, one of the things was to ensure that housing is a clear choice above commercial, all things being equal. We released preliminary results that HRNA had done, kind of looking at affordable housing scenarios given existing standards. I think what showed up very clearly is that in some of our boulevard areas where there's no difference in development standards, the likelihood of developing housing and commercial is equal, and there's definitely favor towards commercial. So it's not a surprise. I think the commission has seen some of those projects come through, and I think that study supported what we're seeing in terms of the applications. There was direction to reconsider the use mix requirements in Bergamot. For very large sites, there's a 50-50 mix requirement that is in the mixed-use creative zone in Bergamot. It's not applied to the Bergamot Transit Village, but that is certainly something that they would like to see shifted more in favor of housing. In terms of process and standards, one of the things, which is kind of things that we're talking about right now in terms of process thresholds and streamlining process for housing projects. I would note in this that, part of what the commission is talking about is what are the trade-offs in moving to that kind of a process, and understanding of, that there are pros and cons to doing that. That's not something that we're being required to do. That's something that can certainly be a local choice. From a standards perspective, there was direction from council to go back to the original 2010 loose. They even talked about, areas where there was tier 3 before, to look at, whether that is something that we need to be studying and bringing back, really within the context of what's necessary to accommodate the RENA. If you were to try and focus, the new development within these focused areas, which is what the loose originally set out to do. The protection of existing housing stock, again, very consistent with the loose. It was intended to relieve the pressure on development in our residential neighborhoods. And council asked us to research kind of like anti-displacement regulations that maybe different cities have tried to experiment with or perhaps have enacted, where they've tried to balance, where growth is incentivized. So this leads us to the work plan, where we're at right now. So based on council's direction on those 4 areas, our overall goal with the work plan is, of course, to have a certified housing element that accommodates the RENA. That is why we're doing all of this. And so all of this work is really leading up, to the goals, policies, and implementation. So the work program that is in the housing element, with these 3 areas to support, affordable housing, incentivize production, retain existing housing stock. So we've divided this up into basically different phases. So what you're in right now, we're in phase 1, which is what we're calling these quick hits. It's quick, but by the end of March, we are bringing forward process thresholds, which is on the agenda tonight, to look at streamlining approvals or review process for 100% affordable housing projects as a first step. It's something that is, so we're looking at these sort of like surgical changes that can be made to the code. The other part is to consider streamlining for HA compliant projects. So that's something, again, that's on the commission's agenda tonight. We are looking at activating density bonus for 100% affordable housing. So like I said, that's something that is already in place. This is a map here showing the areas that are within a half mile of a major transit stop, where if you're a 100% affordable housing project, state density bonus law says you have unlimited density and you have up to 3 extra floors or up to 33 feet if the project has at least 80% lower income and not more than 20% moderate. So we've had a couple of projects that have already taken advantage of that, and I think there's certainly interest from our affordable housing providers in exercising their rights under state density bonus law. We are also implementing 2019 legislation, which is something we have to do, just so that everybody's clear about what the rules are and we don't have inconsistency between what the legislature adopted. So SB 330 was a bill that imposed a series of process streamlining requirements. It banned downzoning. There are tenant protection provisions in there. It is a time-limited bill, though. A lot of things sunset on 2025. So we didn't think it prudent to be amending our code for something that's, potentially going to be in place for 5 years. So we are working on guidance for both our staff and the public with respect to implementation of SB 330. You can expect to see that probably at the end of this month, maybe early next month, just on Santa Monica's approach to implementing that. We are not going to be changing our code to accommodate or to be consistent with that. We will just be compliant with state law. We are removing more ADU barriers in compliance with the changes that state law enacted, so that's coming forward at your next meeting. There were changes to how large family daycares are handled, and then as we indicated, there's also density bonus provisions that we'll be working on. The other part of the thing that we're bringing forward is as part of the new housing models discussions that have been going on for the past year, we received very clear direction from council that there's immediate need to move forward to enact protections for existing housing stock. This is particularly important if we're going to balance it out where we're streamlining process on one end. We want to make sure that it doesn't unduly impact our existing housing stock through impacts on adjacent residential neighborhoods. So what is going to be happening there is there'll be a discussion tonight about what we're going to be doing to bring forward to council on March 10th. This is the clarifications on minimum lease terms, leasing to natural persons, and the domicile issue. Wanted to provide also context that the legislature did pass some pretty strong tenant protections in the past legislative year. As you're well aware, there was AB 1482, which established essentially statewide rent control. There's no-fault evictions, just cause protections, relocation assistance that's required. So a lot of the things I think that we either already do as a city or maybe we're contemplating, are kind of a lot of things were covered, so that's helpful in the sense that we're not having to go down that road on a few things. So end of March, we're into then April through December. This is the huge chunk of what we're calling phase 2. Which is the major part of our work effort. That's research, data collection, and analysis. And all of this is leading, towards developing recommendations and, drafting a public draft of the housing element. So that includes the suitable sites inventory. As you heard me say, this is essentially build-out analysis based on parameters identified in state law. We expect to implement a methodology very similar to the See Downtown 2030 process. But there are, obviously a myriad of other factors that we will be working through and establishing the database to do all of that work. That's going to definitely be a months-long process, having been through that, 2 or 3 times already. It's just the time it takes. We will be running testing in terms of scenario testing to determine, which scenarios are most likely to produce housing. So we're being asked to do that for downtown Bergamot and the boulevards. This is an example just of some of the scenarios, that we've heard from council and some of the discussion that's been had with respect to, kind of backing into at various levels of affordable housing, how much market rate development is necessary to support that. We're looking at different 100% affordable housing scenarios, considering co-living scenarios. And I think, we'll certainly hear ideas for others through the public engagement process. I've kind of put that on the side. I think it's just a given, that's going to be something that's ongoing and going along with this process. Density bonus implementation. So you heard me say, you can see there, we are approaching this in phases because this is something that we're, having to integrate within our land use system. Part 1 is implementing, that's done, which is for 100% affordable housing, they can exercise their rights to that, to the density bonus provisions. Parts 2 and 3 are currently something that we're studying, with respect to how it melds with the city's land use system and bonuses, local bonuses that the city already provides. 3 other areas, you heard me talk about the new housing models. This is sort of the co-living, medium-term housing, several different things. So the part 1 is what we are doing immediately in this phase, and then part 2 is going to be sort of a longer arc of studying feasibility scenarios of what co-living looks like in different housing models. And we're also, going to be asking HCD, can those be counted towards RENA, and in what manner, would that be allowed to occur? We will be studying, exploring minimum density. This is primarily in residential neighborhoods. This is something that is being funded through the SB2 grant. So we'll be testing minimum density scenarios. We want to note that although SB 330 has a replacement housing provision, basically says, you can't build less housing than you're removing, that's actually not a directive to local jurisdictions to upzone or what have you. Like that, it's not like that. It's actually meant to be somewhat protective of existing housing stock, very similar to existing law that already does that for subdivision projects that seek a density bonus. So we've had some projects that couldn't move forward because of a provision like that. So we'll be studying minimum density in that context. As you heard me say, ADUs, there's a lot the city has done already to remove process barriers and standards, and it's a very streamlined process from a zoning perspective to seek an ADU. We've been working with our partners in other reviewing divisions to look at fees and making sure that we're all consistent across the board. These will count towards our RENA allocation, but they're not likely to count for affordable units. So we don't see that as something that's going to be a major source of addressing our 69% affordable allocation. This part here, these three areas here really have to do with kind of public-facing information that is largely funded by the SB2 grant. So these are resources and guidebooks in terms of how to navigate our process, streamlining, speeding up the permit review process with funds towards paying for upgrades to our permitting software. We are going to be preparing, consolidating the city's public-facing materials on tenant and landlord resources. That's something that we've heard over and over again from folks that, come across a situation, they're not sure how to navigate, and they're having to go to 4 different city departments, what have you. So we'll be looking to prepare better communications with respect to that. And then also exploring financing options for affordable housing. So this is largely a lot of the SB2 grant work that was outside of the feasibility testing that was included in that grant. So the conclusion of all of that data collection analysis, we'll be moving into phase 3, which is the recommendations and the continuing work. So at that point, that's largely will be in first, second quarter of 2021. We're expecting to come forward with recommendations for any if it's a big, I don't know the answer to that yet. So whether we need to be processing amendments to the DCP, the Bergman Area Plan, the LUCE, or zoning. We don't know that without having done the work. And I think one thing that we've been also working on is the sort of amendments to the AHPP, maybe even restructuring the program to simplify it and see if we can produce more affordable housing units across the spectrum of units. Right now, of course, it's a bit of a menu system, but that's within the regime that we're in right now. That probably doesn't work quite well for us. And then there's another work effort that runs parallel to all of this, which is looking way ahead, not that far ahead, actually, like 2 years out. If the laws don't change, that we will be subject to SB 35 process streamlining, anticipating a world where we are not compliant. Probably no city in California will be, and so developing objective design standards, doing that work now and getting ahead of it. It's something we haven't had to worry about because the city's actually been compliant, so we've been exempt from SB 35 streamlining, but we're just looking ahead and anticipate that we will be subject to that law. We're also looking to continue to improve our process, to create I think we understand the provisions of SB 330, but we feel like that there's actually a better path that we could create, that would make clearer, more sense for Santa Monica. So that's something that will be ongoing, to ensure that we have an alternative to a bit of a confusing law. So then we move into the final phase, which is adoption, and that's third, fourth quarter of 2021. So that's that October, maybe February of 2022. So that's an adopted, updated housing element, establishing the monitoring, tracking program, across divisions that deal with housing. And we'll also be implementing any actions. You don't have to do all of it right away. You just sort of commit to doing that by a certain time period is what the housing element will say. So I believe, that's pretty much the summary of all the work that's ahead of us. It's quite a lot to do. The bulk of this work is going to be happening between April and probably December, January. So it'll be a very busy time. And we're just starting to get geared up in terms of funding and staffing and what have you right now.
Incredible. Thank you very much. I'm sure we all have questions. No. And I'm going to start actually at the end of the dais with from Commissioner Fonda Bernardi. If you're not ready at this point to ask questions, just pass on to the next person.
Okay, I have a number of questions. We're going to do an EIR for a housing element that's not yet developed. So we're doing the EIR before we have a housing element. How's that working?
Yeah, so
I missed that step.
So, I mean, just like, when we do the LUS or the DCP, is that we have to establish like the project description. So the EIR is going to be really, looking at, how you accommodate the RENA allocation, and what that entails. So it's going to run kind of lockstep with the work that we're doing in developing the suitable sites inventory. So you don't have to have a certified, housing element. You just have to have a program that, you're going to propose forward to accommodate the RENA.
Okay. And what does that cost? What does an EIR on a city scale cost?
We anticipate something in the ballpark of probably $450,000 to $500,000, something like that.
So one affordable housing unit, basically.
I guess, if you want to look at it that way. Yeah.
And right now, it doesn't seem to me to be in the wildest realm of possibility that we can build two-thirds of these units and make them affordable, with regardless of how much streamlining we do, how many stories we add. It just can't be done. The money's not there. Would you agree to that?
Well, I think that the task ahead of us is not to guarantee that those units are going to be built. We're being asked by the state to establish the parameters to demonstrate that it could happen.
Okay.
So
and I'm wondering if today, if someone came to you and said, since affordability will never be achieved, let's just take that off the table. In today, with our current zoning, given that we have 6,000 R1 buildings that could each put in an ADU, and that we have plenty of zoning capacity on the boulevards in downtown Bergamot, could we already on paper show we have room for 9,000 units?
I mean, I think that in theory, if you wanted to say, we have like 22,000-ish parcels in the city, if every single parcel was in play, sure, but that's not the case, right?
No, I mean, even if you subtracted all the parcels that are already maxed out for various reasons, at the end of the day, I suspect we already have the capacity in our current zoning to do everything RENA wants us to do, except we don't have the affordability component. We have 6,000 ADUs ready to go. We just can't make them affordable.
There's the potential for that, sure. I think that, but it's not just producing a whole number, it's the numbers at each income level. So we don't have a program that makes ADUs deed restricted affordable.
I know, no, I understand that, but I'm just saying, affordability will never happen. There's no money there. So if the whole game is quantity, is number of units, if we're going to go down the road of, heaven forbid, trickle-down housing, we just need to show that we have the housing, and we've already have a housing element, and we already have done an EIR for it. And why are we ginning up a whole machine to do something that can't be done?
It's actually not as simple as just demonstrating that you have capacity on, it is definitely an exercise, but the rules changed around developing the inventory such that you have to show that you have the realistic capacity. So our ability to recycle sites, for example, that haven't been developed with housing for the past 2 cycles, or the past 20 years, if they've demonstrated that single-story commercial, 7-Eleven is going to be there, it's going to be hard-pressed for us to say, even though that's a single-story building with a surface parking lot, and it has an FAR of 3.0, and it could have, built to 60 feet, we potentially may not be able to say that is a viable site based on the history of, what has occurred on that property. Now, those are rules that, we're just learning, and that's why we're hiring a consultant to help us understand, because it is new rules, that every city in California is grappling with. So it's not just saying, there's this property and, we're just going to, do a math exercise. I wish it were that easy, but it's not, in terms of the rules that have been established by the state.
Okay. Then the other question I have is really has to do with these alleged tenant protections. And it seems like there's all these very subtle but very shaky tenant protections in here. So I think we're missing one of the things that this is going to be a horrible process for our city, and it's certainly going to be a horrible process for our tenants because many will be evicted to build these 6, 8-story buildings that are being programmed for. Because when you can add 3 stories to any existing parcel, you're looking at 6-story buildings. Units will be lost. Are we going to really be able to protect those tenants? In other words, can we take a building with tenants that's going to be demolished and today have enough capacity to move those tenants and protect them, truly protect them into a new building or an analogous building? Do we have that capability?
Well, I mean, the city can only establish the parameters that, you know, the regulations to, you know, establish a framework around how development might occur. How individual landlords, you know, react to that market. I think, you know, we understand the history of Ellis that has occurred in the city despite, I mean, Santa Monica has some of the strongest rent control laws and tenant protection laws, you know, in the state. And, you know, still people are making choices. And, you know, the Rent Control Board just went through sort of an Ellis study to try and understand what motivates people to do that kind of thing. And it was, you know, it's hard to know because, you know, in looking at our housing stock, a lot of the properties are actually relatively small and medium-sized places. And, you know, so I think one of the things that we are seeing that I mentioned that SB 330 does that is helpful is that it does require that, you know, where housing is being proposed, that you really can't build less than what was there before, which is the problem that we're actually seeing is the loss of, you know, 5-unit buildings or a quadplex or what have you,
Right.
in building a single-family home or a 3-unit condo. That's a common development pattern we were seeing. We are not seeing 5 units being torn down to build 10. Our zoning number 1 doesn't actually allow that many units on the property regardless. In talking with our nonprofit affordable housing providers, their strong preference is not to be in the residential neighborhoods. You know, they're really looking at commercial areas first and foremost, you know, to place their affordable housing. It's certainly not their preference to be, you know, in the neighborhoods, you know, doing that even though that's what the, you know, the law in theory allows, but we haven't seen that activity historically. A lot of our activity has been in the commercial areas, you know, where the city has provided the most incentives, right? And that was on purpose to relieve the pressure from those residential areas.
Okay. 2 more questions. One, it seems that this whole exercise is devoid of any consideration for the availability of water. This runs right up against basically our water neutrality and our sustainability issues regarding water. There's no consideration of that here. Would that be a ground for appeal?
It is a consideration in the CEQA analysis, so we will be analyzing the availability of water.
Let me put it to you this way.
Yeah.
We have a Water Neutrality Act, and people can either make the project that fits under the hat of water neutrality, or they can pay a fee to get out of it. Now, that fee doesn't make more water. It just maintains the existing system, and we know that because we just doubled the fees. In that scenario, we can't buy our way out of water shortages. It's just not there. The water's not there. So it seems to be, again, not only is this project delusional from the ability to provide affordable housing, delusional from the ability to really protect tenants, it's delusional from the ability to provide water for it. And it seems like, where does that fit in to this calculation?
I mean, I guess to go back to your original question, is that a basis of appeal? I only kind of quickly skimmed the appeal law. It's not because it's not something we had, you know, sort of time to dig into. But my understanding is that the basis for availability of water is it has to be something that is imposed by a state agency. So, you know, if you know the water district decided that, you know, you're just not getting your allocation, and so they've made like a decision to lower that allocation, then that would be a basis. I don't know that it's something that is, you know, on a local level.
Right.
But again, I don't, you know enough about.
Okay.
We haven't looked into that process.
Theoretically,
yet,
by state law, when you build 500 or more units, you have to find a water source for
Yep.
it. You have to be able to provide it. We're building, 18 times that, 500 units times.
I mean, we did a water supply analysis in the loose. We did it for the DCP, so that was in total about 6,000 units, that was being analyzed. We're gonna run through the analysis again, and, see how it shakes out. So it'll be part of the EIR process, in terms of analyzing, number of units and water capacity, and obviously the city's approach to water neutrality will be part of that consideration as well.
Okay. Last question, which is analogous to the water question. We also, by 2045, that's a state mandate, we have to get to energy neutrality, and it's going to have to start with our buildings. We have to be building net zero buildings. We can't build a net zero building higher than 3 stories. There's just not enough sunlight hitting that building, given current technology. Maybe technology will improve, but today we can't do this. So again, this whole thing is built on the idea that we can build 7, 8, 10-story buildings all over the city, and somehow magically meet our net zero requirements. Again, where are we going with this? This seems to be another one of those fool's errands.
I think, first of all, I don't think anyone's made a decision that there's going to be 10-story builds, so I don't want that to be, something that is...
It's worse than that. If we had to,
put out there as a guarantee.
If we have to provide 15% more than the 8,800, we're at 10,000.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think that, again, we haven't gone through the work, right? I believe in sort of a data-driven approach, and we need to go through work to understand what we have in front of us. And then there's options that, everybody, decisions people can make as to how to accommodate that. Is it concentrated in a small amount of areas? Is it spread out, so that you have lower buildings potentially over many areas? There's sort of different... geographic patterns, that could take. But I wouldn't sort of, assume at this point that, number one, there's, upzoning is going to happen, or that we're going to have 7 to 10-story buildings everywhere. It may just be in certain areas. These are policy choices that are to come. We haven't done the work yet, and the information's not in front of us.
Right. I noticed that there is an appeal possibility if you can appeal for underproduction for your last 5 cycles. Can you appeal for overproduction in your last 5 cycles?
I don't believe that, no. From just the way the process works, you don't get credit for doing extra.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Fresco, you don't have anything? You want to do it later? I can't hear you. Commissioner McKinnon.
It looks like in the next cycle, the rate of market rate production apartments is roughly similar to what we've produced over the last 8 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, let me go back to that table.
It looks like we've produced 2,100 units in the last 8 years.
Right.
And with more on the way at the moment. And we're being asked to produce about 2,500 market rates in the next 8 years as part of this overall allocation. That would seem to indicate that our real focus absolutely has to be affordable housing in every variation, and that the really tough issues are how we prioritise that to the extent that that's what we produce above all else. Is that the thinking?
That is the thinking, yeah.
Okay, great. And Commissioner Fonda-Bernardi was reaching towards it. These numbers started out at 4,400. In a briefing note that you sent to us, I think sometime last year, they went to 6,000. Then we had 9,200. We're at 8,800. Without going the full appeal, is it possible for the council to call for a review of the numbers at some stage in the basis on which they're produced? Because they do seem to be floating around.
Yeah, I mean, the process, it's not a process we have control over. And, you can't just sort of like write a letter and insert it, and have it considered in the process. There's sort of these, dedicated windows when things can happen. So, the meetings are open to the public, and certainly we have the ability to speak at them and ask for reviews. But whether that's done or not, I think what they're really, SCAG staff has actually put all the tools out there for any city to dig in and do the math yourself if you must. So, that's...
well, how and why do the numbers then float around?
I mean, I think it's tweaks in the methodology. They've said over and over again, these are just estimates. These are tools, you know, that they're using so that cities have a general idea of what their number is. And that's what we've emphasized is like this process is not complete until October, you know, is when it's like totally final. They have explained, you know, the basis of the numbers, which is, you know, the allocations are going to be higher in places where the jobs and the transit and the resources. That is Santa Monica, literally. You know, so that's kind of why we have, you know, the allocation we have. It's not unusual when you see up and down all the coastal cities, you know, have a sort of similar situation. So, you know, we've been following the process along, you know, in terms of the methodology. We've been at every meeting. You know, I think the process they've laid out makes sense. You know, I don't know that it's like, I don't have an opinion about it other than I understand their rationale for how they got there, you know, and, you know, the numbers I think shifted around because from the time the regional council took the vote, it was with like a caveat or a condition that they implement some changes that City of LA had suggested, which is I think what happened with the 9,000 estimate and it changed to this 8,800 one that we have now.
So tonight we're being asked to do some action in the second part of this. Is it likely that every meeting from there on in will be implementing the agenda that you put up there of scouring sites, identifying sites, putting them up, looking at height, density, reviewing plans and so on? Yeah,
we are obviously going to need time to do the work. I can't promise that every single PC meeting is going to be filled with something because we need to do the work and produce something, you know, rational and viable for the commission to respond to. But I think we do anticipate.
Because it just looks like 15 years of plans are going to be concertinaed down into about 12 months.
Yeah.
I'm sure Commissioner Reese is thrilled that he's come back for that 12 months.
Just in time.
Look, he's already talking about leaving. I can see that. How quickly can he get off? Yeah. Thank you.
Are you? No. Are you? Yeah. No. I started it. I apologize. Commissioner Landris.
All right. Thank you very much for that. And I do want to say that I appreciate the work that went into producing the presentation about the work because that was really comprehensive. I have a very small handful of questions. The first is, because there's been this question about the appeals, just for clarification, could another jurisdiction's appeal affect our numbers?
Absolutely it could, yeah. So if there's a successful appeal, so SCAG as a region has about 1.3 million allocated.
Right.
That doesn't go away. That
right.
number is the number. So if, you know, someone's number goes down, that gets reallocated throughout the region in some formula. And
if there's a reallocation, does that open up the opportunity for an appeal? In other words, if we've made the decision as a city right now, okay, we're going to take the number that was given us for a variety of reasons, but then if another city comes along and additional units get added to ours, do we have an opportunity to say, hey, wait a second?
I don't think, Liz, do you? I don't think we do.
We don't?
I think, like, from what I saw from the appeal procedures, there's this appeal period for the initial allocation, and then they are actually like voting on a methodology for the formula for the reallocation. So it'll be an established thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Later in the evening, we're going to talk about some recommended zoning, recommended changes, right, to our thresholds.
Mm-hmm.
We are, by your map, I think, a year and a half out from that fuzzy period of whether things count toward the 5th or the 6th cycle.
Yeah.
If we make those changes tonight, will they help us make the case for the recycling of existing parcels, or will HCD turn around and say, oh, you did that during the 5th cycle, it doesn't count?
Yeah, I mean, if permits are issued before that, whatever the cutoff period they determine, you know, they've told us July, but it seems to be a work in progress, I shall say.
Okay.
You know, that, you know, whatever the cutoff period is, whatever's before that counts, you know, to the 5th cycle and not the 6th cycle.
I understand the permits, but what about the concept of the zoning change? Because it sounds, from what you've said to us.
Oh, I mean, that would just become like the baseline conditions, so to speak, of where
Future.
you're going in. Yeah. So, I mean, we'd be able to say then, you know, that we would have one less thing on our work program to
Right.
do, because
Okay.
we have this process already in place, so.
But for example, to take that theoretical 7-Eleven on a one-story parcel that could go somewhere else,
Yeah.
if we then turned around and said, oh, well, we've eliminated the threshold for review of 100% affordable, we've just made it really easy,
Yeah,
that would be, that change now
Yeah.
in, March of 2020 could be, we could make the case that that should count toward our sixth cycle
Yeah.
developability of a parcel.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, of course, yeah.
Only the projects count.
Right, okay. Are you in the work plan in terms of protection, has there been any discussion of right of first refusal? Obviously, there was a recent major win for the city with the CCSM acquisition of the project, of the parcel on Virginia Avenue. It strikes me that if we're trying to protect existing housing stock, we're going to need to look for tools that may be short of, LA is talking about eminent domain, and there's a debate going on there, but short of that,
Yeah.
what tools do we have?
For, I'm just trying to, there's been so many laws. That concept has floated around, whether it's been adopted, it's not something that's coming to mind right now.
About eminent
But
domain?
No, not
No,
in a
right of
domain.
first refusal.
Right of first refusal
Oh.
on purchase, I just don't remember whether I saw it in draft form or it was adopted. Clearly, if
Okay.
everyone's kind of looking confused,
But
probably not adopted.
hopefully we're having some of those conversations in
Yeah,
terms of.
I think it's on the table as we explore funding possibilities and financing options and different ways to accommodate, to identify sites for this. Public land is something that's on the table, obviously.
And then lastly, and it strikes me as interesting, if you could bring up the 1763 map.
Oh, yeah.
And this is just, I'm getting into the weeds, but I'm just curious when this is going to come back to, when this kind of conversation might come back. So I looked at our zoning map, and we have some neighborhood commercial parcels just at the outside edges of those blue spots, right? So I'm looking at, so are we, Montana Avenue, south side of Ocean Park, north side of Montana. Money and developability aside, is there any, at what point will you be looking at the potential for extending some of those bonuses locally for the purpose of encouraging 100% affordable housing?
Well, that's going to be part of the analysis program.
Okay.
I think what we'll run through, with any build-out analysis, it all kind of starts with, you have to establish, the basics, right? Size of the parcel, what's there right now, how long it's been there, the improvement to, assessed value ratio. All of those things, right? So we're going to pull all those data points together to actually get the sites, run it through the filter of, all the factors in the pseudo-sites inventory that we're still learning about. And I think, that's going to be a consideration, but it's sort of, can we get there without going to that point, to be expanding the half mile or the rights conferred upon this half mile area? It's
Okay.
something that I don't know the answer to yet.
Okay.
But certainly it is something, it's all on the table, right? In terms of how do we get to accommodating a number.
And so those are the kinds of trade-offs, those are the kinds of considerations and trade-offs that we're going to be,
Yeah.
you're going to be looking at, and then we'll
Yeah.
be looking at over the next year. I think to Commissioner McKinnon's point, it is going to be very important for us to essentially loosen the reins as much as possible for the affordable housing production, irrespective of whatever else happens. So I'm very interested to learn more and for us to be, have this public conversation about how we do that
Yeah,
and where we can open things up.
I think as concepts are thought up and vetted internally, it's going to take us a few months to do this work, to bring
Right.
something thoughtful back to you, to consider, with options before we get into recommendations in early next year. So, ideas like that are certainly something we're considering.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Pastor?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for putting this together. It was really, really helpful. And looking ahead. So I have a couple questions. One, do you know what the process would be in order to be able to count co-living towards the RENA allocation?
We don't know that yet. That's one of our research projects.
Okay.
Because number one is we don't yet really know what co-living means in Santa Monica. It's got to start there, yeah.
Okay. And do you think that as we do the EIR for the housing element, there is an opportunity to do a robust EIR that can be either tiered off of or basically obviate the need for further CEQA analysis for some of those 8,800 units that we're building?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we usually aim to do.
Yeah, as it was one of the processes for streamlining.
Mhm,
That would be
mhm.
great.
Yeah, I mean, it's been done really, when we had the Lucy IR and the DCP IR, a lot of our housing projects that are going through the pike right now, they're either exempt because they're ministerial,
Mhm.
you know, or they're exempt because they're in these transit priority areas, so.
Great. And for as I think it's in phase 2, you're going to do some testing to determine scenarios most likely to produce housing.
Yeah.
Is that a contract that's already been awarded, or is that something the HRNA is going to do?
Yeah,
Or is
so
that something that is it's part of the RFP?
They are already under contract to have done the analysis that was initially authorized, which was to study like existing standards only. They have the model, you know, they have all the assumptions. They were with us in the stakeholder meetings, you know, so we anticipated working with them as part of the SB2 grant, which expands that scope into other scenarios. You know, I think we're going to have to run many different scenarios, and you know, we'll definitely be touching base with the development community and, you know, testing those assumptions.
Yeah, so
and then,
can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh,
At this time, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of complaints that the assumptions aren't realistic.
yeah.
And so I want to make sure that as we're testing the models, that the assumptions are really vetted with the community.
Yeah, I mean, they were, so with the current work that was done, we did have stakeholder meetings with, you know, a session, a sort of roundtable session with developers to hear their thoughts. A lot of I will say it's hard to get comps because we haven't had a ton of activity outside of downtown. You know, a lot of the comments and experiences we were hearing about were with respect to downtown as opposed to outside of it. So from the perspective of land cost, there was, you know, a few people that are out there. Actually, our affordable housing providers are probably most active in that arena. Right now, you know, we are hearing certainly a lot of input about construction costs, you know, and that's something that we will continue to take into account.
And so then in a similar vein for sort of the first phase of the quick hits,
Yeah.
So as between now and the time, it looks at the end of March that you're going to come back, are there going to be opportunities for public involvement and public comment?
On phase 1?
On the phase 1.
The public, because of the speed at which this is going, and these are relatively, I think what we feel these are things we have to do, like the law is the law, and, you know, we're trying to implement it. So, you know, we haven't done like a big outreach strategy around it. The public, you know, involvement has really been at these public hearings. As we launch into the analysis phase and the developing recommendations, options, we are definitely going to be out there in the community between April and starting in, you know, April through December, kind of educating people about what the housing element is, like what's happening, what to expect. You know, that's just, we haven't had time, given what we've had to do here, to sort of be out there explaining what's to come.
But if there are things that we consider as low-hanging fruit, like, I think, unit mix or density bonuses in commercial, to happen in the first phase, is that a possibility, or is your first phase, do you feel like that's already set of what you think those are going to be, because they're essentially reactions to what the new state laws are?
We're pretty set, and like we're already deep into the program to bring forward things into council on March 10th and the 24th. I don't think we really don't have capacity to add more things. You know, the density bonus issue is not a simple one. I mean, I'll just be super candid. It's quite complicated, actually, given Santa Monica's land use system, you know, that we have. So, you know, we're taking time to think through that. And again, within the context of our allocation at the moment is 69% affordable housing. And so every decision that we make, you know, and how we move forward is run through that filter of, are we getting affordable housing units? Are we maximizing it in some way? You know, and I think our concern is that if you release, you know, the reins on something and you have development capacity swallowed up, right, instantly, and, you know, you have affordable housing and that competing, that's a problem there in terms of being able to identify enough sites to accommodate the affordable housing that we're supposed to accommodate. So, you know, thinking through that lens, you know, as the council directed, is really, you know, directing how we prioritize, you know, what's brought forward.
Okay, two more quick questions. One is, you may have talked about this previously, but do we get credit if you are extending the affordability covenants on a project that is going to expire?
No.
We don't.
I don't think so.
I don't think, because it's
It's gotta be
already
new
counted
units.
Has to be a new unit, okay.
previously, yeah.
And how does the LCP play into some of this?
Well, we are trying
Because,
to get it certified.
right, I mean, we have to get it certified, but
Yeah.
we could have units that get approved here that then get overturned at Coastal or don't happen at Coastal. So do we get credit for those units?
Yeah, I mean, well, what we get credit for is when a permit is issued.
Is it when a permit is issued or when an entitlement is
No,
approved?
when a permit is issued. So the
there-
entitlement never, I mean, we have to report to HCD on entitlements. They want to kind of see the pipeline and what have you, but what ultimately counts, you know, for your arena is permits issued.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Reese?
Thank you for the presentation. Just to follow up on one of those things, it seems like we should try to push back on that issue of extending housing covenants and getting that to count. I mean, because otherwise those become market rate units, and well, I guess it's a unit, but still, it's got to be helpful to our cause to extend those somehow.
Yeah,
And then we should figure out a way to take to
yeah,
get some
the
credit.
Housing Division actually prepared a report, I want to say like 2 or 3 years ago, identifying properties that were, you know, coming on that timing out on their provisions. And it was an info item, you know, that went to the council. And I think it, you know, largely, a lot of them are actually operated by affordable housing providers, so the risk is actually very low in terms of losing those units, since the mission is to provide affordable housing. So, you know, but certainly that's a point we can bring up, you know, and see if there's any traction there.
Okay. A couple of questions. One on costs. You know, as one of the other commissioners talked about, it's going to take a lot of money to build the affordable housing. Would part of our research here over the next year and a half look at different funding streams where we could get money for housing? That will be part of the conversation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Also, and then reducing costs. And, you know, what I'm seeing, I see these astronomical numbers for projects I'm working on which are affordable, but where people are heading right now is modular construction. So maybe more of a statement than a question, we should be looking at how we can streamline that in our building and safety process so that we can build them. Because what a lot of the road projects I'm hearing is they're running into problems with building and safety, getting them permitted, and then it's more importantly the inspectors looking at them. So I think that should be part of the equation here, is how we can try to incentivize the modular construction. And then will we be looking at another cost-related issue, is all the fees. You know, when we went through kind of the loose, there seemed to be a sentiment of community doesn't really like development, so if you're going to develop, you're going to pay through the nose. And that's creating a lot of hardship, I think, on building these projects. So is that part of your calculus? And
I think that it'll be part of the consideration. I don't know that we're going back to, you know, redo our impact fee system. It is adopted, it's in place. So it will be part of the model testing to understand the implications it has on the likelihood of housing production, and, you know, what the levers are, you know, whether that is something that is a major factor, or is it something else, you know, that moves the needle better. I think that's part of the work.
okay. My guess is that research is going to tell you that there's very little chance that it's one issue, and it's a combination of a lot of things.
Yeah.
So,
That's the feedback we've heard so far.
Then I would just also highlight to you, there was a couple of bills that came out from a Representative Chu, I believe his name was, which talked about creating funding streams for cities to create sustainable districts and workforce districts. And whether you guys have looked into those yet, but it seems like there was money for the environmental work up front, and then once you got it implemented, the cities got cash bonus money.
I remember looking at legislation like that, recall it not being super helpful for us, given the time frame that we're dealing with, and when the funding would be available. But we are aware of those kind of like opportunities.
Remind me what some of the levers are that the state has if we don't comply. We've talked about SB 35, and as somebody who gets to approve work on SB 35 projects in the city of LA, they're incredibly successful in getting projects approved. Communities don't really love them, so that is one big piece of leverage we have, or that the state has. But what are some of the other lever points they have, or leverage points?
Yeah, the bigger part has to do with eligibility for funding. You know, if you have you're out of compliance on your housing element, it affects the city's ability to compete for, transportation funding. The housing and RTP cycles are, they run together for that reason. So, that's a pretty big deal for us because we depend actually a lot of that transportation funding to fund our mobility programs. So I think that's a bigger thing. I think there's most of the other penalties that I'm aware of that are sort of like impactful are, where the city refuses to approve housing. Those penalties are pretty, substantial for.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Let me just add to that. My understanding is, and maybe Heidi can correct me, that there are actually substantial fines in the new legislation. That if you are out of compliance with RAIN or your housing element, the Department of Housing can go to the Attorney General and start an action against the city.
Yeah.
And there's supposed to be, meetings and let's work it out, what have you, in the process. But if we lose, the fines could be $10,000 to $100,000 a month. So that's substantial teeth.
Interesting. I wonder.
Do you want to add to that, Liz?
I need to check this further, but I believe some of that pertains to whether you have a compliant housing element as opposed to actually being in compliance with producing your number of units that your RENA requires.
So it's the RAINA that brings on the fees, the fines, or the housing element?
Yeah,
I think it's the RAINA.
I mean, we're obviously of like Huntington Beach, that kind of got the book thrown at them because they.
Right, but that was before this legislation became effective.
They acted to do it. So it was. They weren't in compliance with their requirements. Yeah.
But that was before this new law.
Right. Like if you have something in your program that says, we commit to doing this, within 6 months of the adoption, and you do something completely different, the opposite, like that would be something that would, I think, raise eyes. But, really, if we're doing the best we can and we're following the rules and we have the programs and we're doing what we said we would do, and the units aren't coming, there's not like a penalty just because, we don't have control over.
Well, hopefully they'll look at it that way.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. I assume that this is going to be a very difficult challenge, and we're going to do the best we can, but it's interesting. I wonder how many cities are just going to wait this out and wonder if there's a regime change in the state legislature that changes this. Then my last question for you is, I apologize that I don't know the answers, but you guys keep alluding to the fact that you've implemented 1763 and the unlimited density, or the increased density and the height increases. How are we doing that? Are we doing that on our commercial corridors where we don't have density limitations?
Yes. Yeah, we're doing it.
So really, we're giving extra height. But
no. So in commercial areas, because the law says you have unlimited density, it allowed us to say, okay, this makes sense because we didn't have to deal with how do you apply a bonus to an area that has no maximum density, right? So if you're within a half mile of a major transit stop, there's no density limit. That's what the state law says. So affordable housing projects, like I said, I'm aware of two, that have taken advantage of this, and one is an administrative project, so they are allowed to to have up to 3 extra floors or up to 33 feet and the unlimited density in addition to, I think it's like 4 concessions
For
or
incentives. And
yeah.
so then they're combining that with
Yep.
bigger FARs or
Yeah, so,
reductions.
so we're, any affordable housing provider, 100% affordable housing provider that meets the parameters of that density bonus law, they are well aware of what's available to them.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple questions. I know you're all tired of hearing questions, but thank you for your presentation. It's really impressive, and I'm glad to see progress is in the offing. I have one question which I have asked repeatedly, and I'm asking this really sort of for the benefit of the 2 housing commissioners who are in the room whose responsibility the AHPP is. For the life of me, I cannot understand how H&RNA is modeling the second phase of AHPP without knowing what the ultimate zoning is going to be. Can you respond to that?
Well, no, like I said, I think we're looking for input, and we just haven't started that work because we've just been in the administration of like setting up the grant funding. There's a whole process to accept it and set up the accounts and what have you. But what we anticipate in that scenario is probably like a backing into, given different scenarios for affordable housing, what market rate development parameters are necessary to support that, as an example, of a scenario that might be run. Another example may be, what does it take to make affordable housing viable in this location, given a certain set of assumptions. So, I think we've not landed on scenarios, but I mean, those are just like thoughts that we've been having in terms of, different scenarios that they may be testing with respect to affordable housing, specifically with respect to the AHPP, because there's an inclusionary housing ordinance.
Right.
We'd be interested in knowing, and this is in relation to the suitable sites inventory, where you recycle sites, you have to have 20% set aside for the lower income. And so, we don't have a program like that right now, right? The minimum is lower than 20%. What does it take to support something like that?
I guess my question is, maybe I'm just simple-minded about this. We don't know where Bergamot's going to end up. I mean, for all we know, it could be 6 stories, 8 stories, 5 stories. What the FAR is, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
How on earth do you do an inclusionary feasibility study not knowing that?
So I'm looking at it differently. We're not doing it from the top down of deciding, here's where it's going to be 12 stories and, whatever the FAR, like we're not taking that approach. We're looking at it from the perspective of backing into what is the minimum necessary to make this likely for housing.
Obviously, for larger projects, you could have more of an inclusionary requirement.
Yeah, you might, but I think that's why, like, I'm not saying we've decided we're only modeling like 3 different scenarios. There could be many
Right.
different scenarios. And there's absolutely going to be input as to what, should be studied.
And how useful do you
so-
think the phase 1 study is, since that's existing zoning, which is likely not to
Well,
be the case?
so they were, that was something that we were asked by council to do specifically, right, is to look at existing standards and what if we increased the inclusionary. That was a question council wanted
I understand.
answered, and the analysis was done. And, it is what it is. It's been released, and, those are the results that are out there, so.
Another question is it not true that the state will zap you if you don't meet your market rate quota in ARENA? I know one thing they will do is look at any inclusionary housing program that you have in existence and how that may have impacted market rate construction.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
So the market rate production is important from the standpoint of ARENA compliance too,
Sure.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's important at all levels.
It's important. All of it's important.
Yeah, all of it is.
Have you explored with the state of the possibility of doing not annual performance reports, but maybe biannual or every 3 years or whatever, because of the incredibly larger number this time? It may not be as easy to comply with.
I don't think we get to decide that. We have to report every year, so.
It seems like maybe that should be thought about.
Again, not our decision. That's. Yeah.
And then
We're gonna be producing
in the
those,
current
yeah.
housing element, we actually listed twice as many properties as the RENA number. It's like 3,700 versus 1,700, whatever. So I'm just wondering if only listing 10 to 15% more than our RENA allocation is enough. I guess we'll find out. Because the other possibility, of course, is that none of these sites are going to be for sale. So how are you going to build housing on properties that aren't for sale? And does the state accept that as a reason for not complying?
Maybe, yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
It seems logical. but-
You know, again, like I said, we're learning about the rules. And we have heard in, some of the initial webinars and, education, these forums that we've been part of with HCD staff, they've indicated that, there will be definitely a lot of scrutiny in the sites that are chosen. And, if it's something, like I said, that has, shown a history of not being on the market and, it's been there for 50 years, it's like, well, what makes you think that's going to turn over to housing right now? I mean, there'll be, there's going to be a lot of pushback on proving that whatever we select, is a real site, so.
The other thing, and I'm glad you're doing the public land inventory. That's all public agencies. It's not just the city or the school. It's the state
Yeah.
too, and the feds, I assume.
Right.
And clearly, a lot of those public properties, and I can think of one in particular at 26 in Cloverfield, which I shall not name, or is it Broadway, that is not surplus. So I don't know if you're limiting yourself to surplus properties, because that's a very limiting factor. I would look at all public properties that are potentially developable and then approach the public agency about declaring it surplus.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that was council's direction. I think that DMV site was something that was mentioned specifically by more than a few council members as something to explore. I think what can be said for the property that the city owns is obviously we have control over it, and we can decide what happens with it. So, that's obviously a place to start.
The assembly member is looking at the DMV site too, so it helps to have someone at the state level to advocate that. Let's see. And then finally, I just don't understand this density bonus situation for commercial sites. There are those in the community who believe that the current state density bonus law applies to commercial sites. And we haven't figured out, or we don't want to do, or whatever the heck, we're not doing that. And there are other jurisdictions that are doing it on commercial sites that don't use density as a criterion, West Hollywood being one of them. Why aren't we looking at those examples? And I mean, someone said that's low-hanging fruit, and it is. It's already the law, and we could actually get more units if we put the density bonus program into place for commercial sites. So why aren't we doing that? It's a rhetorical question.
Well, I do think I want to clarify one thing. So this is something that I don't want to give anybody the impression that we've ignored the state density bonus law in our commercial districts. It's very clear if you look at our development standards in commercial districts that you get increased height and FAR if you build housing and if you build housing with the HPP, meeting the HPP requirements. So those are baked into the code already.
All the commercial districts?
Yes. So what we're doing right now is overlaying the changes in state law with what we already have baked into the code.
So currently, if a market rate, a mixed income, whatever the heck, market rate developer comes into the city and says, I'm going to include low-income units, they would get a density bonus of some form.
So because there are no maximum density controls, we haven't actually, it's not necessarily called a density bonus. You get increased height and FAR baked into the code. Your tier 1 height and FAR is bigger if you have, is increased if you are building housing in a commercial zone, and it's increased if you're building housing.
For mixed income?
Yes.
And that comports with state law, you think?
Well, so that is already baked into the code. That is what we are reviewing, given the changes that have occurred in state density bonus law since.
I got you. Okay. What? Yeah, that's true for everything, apparently.
No, we're back to that again, are we?
Okay, that's it.
5 years old.
And I really want to thank you again. Oh, one other thing. Someone in the community mentioned to me recently about creating a housing element task force, which I think is an excellent idea.
Great.
Like we do with R1. I don't know if that would come from us or the city council, but I think sort of a broad-based housing element community group involved in the process, like the R1 process, which was very fruitful. Thank you, Ross. We should explore that. And I don't know if that's us or the city council. Do you have any ideas?
Like I said, we just to get this.
I understand.
Understanding like what we need to do. We usually spend quite a bit of time actually thinking through as a team what the public engagement process for an update like this looks like. This is effectively like something like the loose compressed into 8 months, which as you know, the loose took something
Well, the
like
public can
6
hold
years.
things up, we know
So-
that.
So,
But-
you know, I think, you know, as you know,
Yeah.
we are always thoughtful with how we approach public engagement, and, you know, our intention is to be inclusive, you know, with the community, and I think.
No, I
something
understand
like
all
this
that.
might
I
be
just think, because I was on the R1 task force, and it was really worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there were a lot of meetings of the minds that would not otherwise have even been in the same room, much less
Right.
meeting together with minds. It would be a really good idea, I think, to think about a housing element task force
Mm-hmm.
and to bring in all the sectors who are affected by housing in Santa Monica.
It's certainly something we can consider. We want to make sure that, given the compressed time we have.
I understand.
That whatever process we have for public engagement is effective and, you know, to the process, and that we have a purpose, and everyone understands what the goal of having a task force is versus.
Well, I think
you
part of
know,
the
a
problem is that what we're
different
going to
kind of-
talk about may be extremely radical. So
Yeah.
the more buy-in that we get from the community or not, the better.
Chair, could I make
Yes.
a couple of comments?
Of course.
And the reason is that, regrettably, I didn't realise that housing would be on tonight, otherwise I wouldn't have done this, but I do have to leave in half an hour and go somewhere. And yet, I feel as if we're at the start of what would normally be a multi-year marathon process that's going to be run at sprint speed, with a lot of turmoil and dislocation, and we don't yet have a community that's across the fact that it's 8,800 units are coming to our city shortly. In fact, from what you've said, we've got to plan more for about 10,500 units to be in permit to allow the no net loss. And so, given that our historic rate of building is 200 units a year, that's an enormous change, and I don't think this community's yet ready for it mentally, and they're going to have to get ready because you've outlined very graphically there is no alternative. It's not as if it's a discussion, and it's not as if the City Council's decided, oh, we might appeal it. We might review the numbers, whether or not we're at the right number, and Commissioner Fonda Bernardi and I have discussed, are we at the right number and so on. But there is no alternative, so we have to move ahead. It seems as simple as that. And so tonight, in the second half, we're going to have a look at some of the processes and streamlining for affordable housing. I would suggest that we need to look at extending that to Tier 2. In the time that I've been on this commission, Planning Commission review of a DRP has been utterly useless, and we've never knocked one back, and we've never really substantially changed it. It may be the unzoning compliant that have a change. And so we start tonight, but the other thing that has struck me as you have discussed it is we may have a target of 10,000 units, but the reality is the hardest target of all is those 6,800 affordable units. There is no funding source for them, and yet they are the units that need to be prioritised above all else, with densities and bonuses and changes, because it does seem to me that there is a demand for market rate units here from developers. They see this as a river of gold and a place that they can come and make money, and they always have and always will. And so that's my focus in future going forward. How do we create affordable housing in this city in a way which will enable people to live here, and that we do meet these RENA numbers if there is no alternative, as you have said. And that's going to create a lot of issues. And we need to be on top of it. We need to be leading that discussion going forward. So it's not just a rubber stamp operation this next 8 months. It's how we engage the community. The Chair was talking about that. I think it's actually quite a good idea. I'd love to have seen the R1, you meeting minds with people. Quite entertaining. But this tonight is the smallest of the changes to remove some of these impediments. But I'm hoping we're really radical going forward in removing all the impediments and fees and so on for affordable housing, removing all the barriers, and then encouraging people to do it. Otherwise, we're not going to get to where we want to go to. And so I think the level of interest here tonight is quite intriguing. But it has to be a start. So thank you very much for the presentation. It was revelatory in more ways than one. And I'm not sure, as a planning commission or as a city or as a planning department, we've quite got across everything we need to at this stage to prepare for what's coming. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, hang on for the ride, I guess.
Oh, actually, I have one final question, Jane. I want to clarify, because I think I know this, and I've been saying it for years, that only new construction counts for RENA, right?
Right.
So a project such as the one that CCSM just did in Pico, where they bought an endangered apartment building and put a 55-year deed restriction on it, doesn't count.
Yeah,
And I
because those are
think,
existing.
I mean, that's not within our power to change, but I think that really needs to be looked at the state level, because clearly we're taking market rate units and making them affordable for long term. Well, it's like what you would, the preservation thing. So anyway,
Yeah. I mean, we report on acquisition rehab, but it doesn't.
it doesn't
for-
count.
Yeah.
Commissioner Landers.
So, and this is a late question, but Commissioner McKinnon's comments prompted. I guess on Monday, there's going to be the opening town hall for the Santa Monica 2050 process. And one of the things that I'm thinking about, listening to the complexity of this process and the impact that this process will have over the next decade on our city, is also on the essentially the health of our internal economic engine. I think there is a risk that I think there's a risk that we could become, at some level, entirely, I don't think it'll happen, but move toward being a bedroom community with housing at two ends of a barbell. And so I hope, and this is more an expression of a hope rather than a question of how are you going to do this, because I think it's a longer conversation, potentially why a housing element task force could be an interesting piece, is how do we use this, right, to both fulfill our compliance goals, but also make sure that we're creating through that our land use policy is contributing to a sustainable city. Commissioner Fondo Bernardi talked about water and power, which are critical, but we also have to look at the economic health. What happens when we take a commercial property and turn it into a residential, and what are the consequences for the economic activity that's going to happen on the ground floor? Mm-hmm. Who's it accessible to? Who's it serving? Mm-hmm. So I would hate for this process to go all the way down to a place where we end up creating all of this new housing, but then we've somehow hollowed out our economic basis, or somehow moved it to extremes. Mm-hmm. So that we are sort of a simultaneously rich and struggling community, and not a community that's building opportunity for everybody, which I think we need to work on becoming, so that there's much more of a diamond shape.
Is this a question?
No, it's an expression of
Okay.
of hope. It's more of a diamond shape than a barbell shape. It's oratory. That's right.
It's oratory.
Come on, it's no, it's a request. Last time we had this presentation on parking in the downtown, and we didn't ask about the impact of the parking on the health of the promenade. Here I'm asking about the impact of our land use and our housing policies on the economic health of the city, and I hope that we will hold those together.
I appreciate the expression of hope. I mean, we were, as one of the primary authors of the Loose, I mean, we worked through a long community process to carefully curate, what the growth strategy would be for the city through 2030. This is, quite an intrusion into that process, and so, we are really trying to think through how we do this thoughtfully in a way that makes sense for Santa Monica. That what you're describing is not lost on us, in terms of how we balance out, the sort of contract that we all agreed upon, just 10 years ago, right, on how this all unfolds. So, that's going to be part of the next, 8 months, sort of that conversation about how all of that is accommodated.
Commissioner Pastor.
Go ahead.
Quickly, so on more than one occasion here tonight and at other meetings, sometimes someone says, oh, it would be great to talk to the state about that. Or could we make that suggestion, or could we have cleanup legislation? Is there a mechanism by which ever those comments get transmitted to our assembly member or our senator, or how does that work?
We have, so it's really kind of transmitted through staff, because we have occasionally, our lobbyists are always sending us like legislation that, kind of, they flag for us to review. We have opportunity at the beginning of every legislative session and throughout the legislative session to communicate through them, kind of what we think are the priorities, and policy positions are drafted by the council liaison's, office, and so that's sort of how these sorts of things are communicated up, sort of issues that we see, that would be helpful for the cause and, are supportive of council's platform, to support housing and that sort of thing. So, it happens sort of throughout the year, on a regular basis through the city's lobbyists.
I have one last question. This is something that Commissioner McKinnon referred to. The actual target numbers have been fluctuating. They've been floating.
Yeah.
And there was a representation made that, the model's all open, anyone can see it. And you and I know that it's very hard for individuals, even groups like us, to reach into the model and game it, say, we turn this way, we turn that. What's the implication? But clearly someone's reaching in and turning those dials. And the RENA process, SCAG in particular, has had a long history of people putting their fingers on the scale, Beverly Hills being the poster child for that. So because of that, and because the numbers have been fluctuating, and because no one really understands the model unless they've gone in with the intent of tweaking it, why wouldn't every city appeal their numbers, if only to protect themselves when another city appeals or puts their finger on the scale? That surplus is going to end up, some of it's going to end up on our back. And so it seems like, yes, there's this whole open process and, anyone can see the model, but the history has been just the opposite. It's not an open process, and it's not likely to be in this environment.
I wouldn't disagree with you that the RENA process has been very political.
Even in the last 3 weeks, how did it go from 9,000 to 8,800?
As I was explaining, I think, what occurred from the time that it was adopted with conditions that City of LA had suggested at the last minute, and so, what you're seeing is sort of, I think, the result of some of those tweaks. But, the legislative changes that were made in 2017 were meant to specifically address the issues that have occurred in the past with the RENA process. I think that the legislature saw kind of what was happening, within each council of governments and within each region, and how allocations were occurring. And, what's happening this time and why there's been so much interest is because, it's really, the intent is to go through a more objective process, that is based on, housing being where jobs are, where transit are, where transit is, where the resources are. And so, those are the three main factors they've told us. This is based on existing need, existing unmet need, which was not something that was accounted for before. So, the changes that were made to the state law were intended to address those very deficiencies in the process that have occurred with prior RENA cycles. So, it's not just our numbers that are, every jurisdiction has, largely has much higher allocations, than they have in prior years. And I don't have any reason to believe that SCAG staff has been trying to game things or anything like that. We've been at meetings, like I said, the models that they put forth are all available online. They've tried to explain what the changes were. There's, PowerPoints that sort of break down, in terms kind of what's happening. And so I think we found that very helpful, and we've tried our best to communicate what's happening in that process to you all and to the council as well.
Well, just like LA City reached in and turned the dial and it happened, we got 200 less. Mm-hmm. Why aren't we reaching in and turning the dial to bring the number into something more reasonable?
Well, they were doing something to tweak it within the parameters of what the law says you're supposed to do, in terms of it may have actually increased their allocation. I think it did. I can't be certain of that, but I think it actually did, to the, while decreasing others. So, when Mayor Garcetti was speaking at this, I think he stated that, this could be to their own detriment, but they were putting it forward because it was the right thing to do. So it's, every city's going to make their decisions on how they address this issue, understanding that everybody's accountable, for housing.
Okay, thank you.
I was listening to you talk about the public process that we went through with the loose and the public buy-in with the loose, and how this is kind of throwing a lot of that out and taking away a lot of our discretion as a city, our discretion as a commission, and in in so doing, taking away opportunities for the public to weigh in on projects. And, I really think a lot of the literature about how the state is approaching solving these problems vilifies the public and the input that they give. And I would like to see us as a city, I was thinking of this really in relation to the next item where we're really literally removing public process by making things ministerial. But we need to, I think, establish a much greater transparency in what is happening in those ministerial processes. I don't know that it has to be a complicated thing. It could be a very simple thing, just whatever the application that is submitted is, it should. Let me speak. It's related to the next item. It's the main thing that has been burning in my head is that we're not talking about process functions that we're losing. And if there can be simple ways to make sure that the public can see through the opacity that these new rules and processes are creating, I think that would be a really important thing. And we can talk more about it in the next discussion with these guys, but that's the main thrust of what I hear, that I feel like we're really losing a lot in that area.
So much better when you can't hear me. We are going to take a break for several reasons. One is that Commissioner McKinnon has to leave, and apparently we want to take a picture of him, of us with him. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll go on to the next item. No, not 5.
All right, so much for our 10-minute break, or our 10-minute break is now over. I've been asked to kick us off again. We're going to jump right into item 6A, proposed amendments to the text of the land use and circulation element, Bergamot Area Plan and Downtown Community Plan. We do have a staff report, I assume. Do we have a staff report? Sorry.
Sorry, I was eating my Twix
I'll
bar.
start reading the staff report. Recommended action.
This is actually a brief staff report. So these are proposed amendments to the text of the LUCE, the Bergamot Area Plan, and the Downtown Community Plan to amend the application process thresholds for 100% affordable housing and housing projects, other housing projects compliant with the Housing Accountability Act. So these would be market rate housing projects largely. This comes about from, as we discussed, Council's direction in their study session to support 100% affordable housing. They were very clear about removing barriers to the production of 100% affordable. That seemed to be across the board. So this is an initial action to be responsive to Council's direction. The justification for that is we are seeing for 100% affordable housing projects, they are largely being funded through tax credit funding right now, sometimes in combination of the city's trust fund and tax credits. Those have very, very strict deadlines in terms of when entitlements must occur and when they must pull building permits. We have definitely done everything we can to assist our housing providers through that process, but this will definitely streamline the process tremendously in terms of guaranteeing that they can make it through the process and take advantage of those tax credit application dollars. For the housing projects that are compliant with the Housing Accountability Act, this is really something that we brought forward really for discussion. It was part of the direction from council, but as a staff, I think it would be responsible of us to sort of ensure that the commission has a full discussion about what it means and the trade-offs in moving towards an administrative process for projects like this. Understand that the commission in the past has wanted to talk with applicants about what's in the project description, and you have established certain conditions and the like, some of which may or may not be able to be codified. So you had expressed interest in understanding and providing your ideas as to what that might be, but that's certainly something you can discuss tonight. This issue is before you with respect to the process thresholds for those two kinds of housing projects.
Great, thank you. Are there questions from commissioners before we open up the public comment? I believe there are 4 requests to speak, and Chair Lambert is back.
Okay, the first chit is Dave Rand, followed by Denny Zane and Jason Islis.
Good evening, Commissioners. Dave Rand, Armbruster, Goldsmith, and Delvac, here tonight representing a number of very interested, watchful, potential Santa Monica housing developers. I think it's great that you're streamlining the processing on HAA-compliant projects. I'd encourage you to go farther. If you take the important step of making a current Tier 2 DRP and AA, go the next step and make what are now DAs in the downtown and the Bergamot area plan, now development agreements, make them DRPs. It has been my experience through numerous projects, the development agreements, which are now the development rights that you need to achieve in order to come close to your RENA objectives. Those projects don't happen because no one wants to submit to the DA process. So that's an easy, streamlined approach. Set a reasonable, affordable standard for those level of projects, and you will see developers come to the table and do them. I can't help responding to some of the density bonus discussion. I sent the Commission a few months ago a very long legal memo explaining why the density bonus law applies in the commercial districts. It's great that you've applied 1763 to 100% affordable projects. 1763 is just an amendment to the density bonus law. If you open that up to those projects, you have to open it up to all projects. The law is incredibly crystal clear that density bonus incentives and concessions are available to qualifying projects, even if no density increase is taken. So the notion that we don't regulate the boulevards and the Bergamot and the downtown by density, therefore you can't apply a density bonus, is just simply inaccurate. There's a formula and a way to do this. West Hollywood does it very well. I'll walk through it briefly. Say a hypothetical Tier 3 project that hopefully is a DRP in the Bergamot area plan, 2.2 FAR, 57 feet in height for a base height. West Hollywood says, okay, normally you'd get a 35% density increase in terms of units and lot area. Let's convert that to an FAR bonus. 2.2 FAR becomes a 3.0 FAR. You get another story, 10, 11 feet, single story of height on top of that as a second concession. That 57 feet goes to 68 feet. So then the question is, how do you establish a base density under which you apply the affordable housing calculation? So let's say in that new 3.0, 68-foot envelope, you can fit 150 units total, maxing out. So you take 150 and you divide that by 1.35. You back out the density bonus. That establishes a base density of 111 units. You then multiply whatever the inclusionary requirement is on 111 base density. So if it's a 20% affordable requirement that you establish on a new Tier 3 DRP in the Bergamot area, it's 20% times 111, that yields 23 affordable units. 150 total units, 23 affordable units. It's a very elegant system. It works. They have other bonuses that they apply for mixed-use projects, for architectural design, for sustainability. The bonuses get layered onto the base, and then you apply the density bonus onto that in the formula that I laid out. It works. Projects happen. I'd encourage the city to do something like that. And I can tell you that while it's wonderful that the city is looking to implement the density bonus law and it's actively underway, the state law is very clear that density bonus projects may proceed absent city implementation. So you don't need to adopt an implementing ordinance for these projects to come forward. They're going to come forward. And I hope that implementation happens to set the rules of the road clearly in a straightforward way. But it is a good thing because, to quote the chair, it is low-hanging fruit. It will allow projects that are marginal or infeasible now to actually be viable and to happen. It will get you more units. It will get you more affordable units. It won't get you to 8,800, but it will help. And it will do so in a way that doesn't require, at least in that piece of it, significant upzoning, new EIRs, and what have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have
Mr. Rand, will you tell me how you got to the original number, which you then backed out? So you took the FAR from 2.2 to 3, and then what was your denominator? Or numerator, whatever.
Right,
you know what I mean?
So basically you apply the 35%, what would be a density bonus as
Right,
an
to the
bonus,
FAR.
right? Then you allow the height. So then you establish your
Right.
ultimate envelope.
Right.
So then you allow the developer to fill that box. How many units can you get in that box? And let's just say hypothetically you can fit 150, maybe 175.
But what is the fitting based on? Is it based on a minimum unit size for the jurisdiction in West Hollywood?
I don't believe West Hollywood has minimum unit sizes, so it's a matter of what you can fill up the box with. There's ground floor requirements. If there's unit mix requirements, you have to abide by that. But whatever those requirements are, ultimately, like that's how we do it now, right? I mean, if we have a Tier 2 project in the mixed-use boulevard, that's 50 feet and 2.25 FAR, we have to comply with the unimix and all that stuff, but whatever fits in, right? So it's the same concept here, right? And so I just made up the number, 150 units, pulled it out of the head. But the point is you then divide that by 1.35 to back out that 35%, and that's your base density.
Wouldn't, it seems like you would look on a project-by-project basis, so you would look at the number of the units in that project being proposed and what the average square footage is to do the formula.
Right, but I mean, normally, like in an LA, right, in a certain zone, the minimum size is 800 per unit or 400
We don't have a
per
minimum
unit,
size for
right? So
market
we don't
rate.
have that.
Right.
So it's how do we get to the numbers? I'm just curious about.
Right.
I have a question. The city attorney actually had said that we are compensating for whatever you're talking about by having the extra floor or whatever on, Why don't you say it?
So when this system was put into place, in the commercial districts, there is, and I just verified it. So in the neighborhood commercial, there's not extra height, but there's extra FAR in every commercial district, and there's extra height in the other mixed use in commercial districts.
Well, what's the point of having an increased FAR if you don't have increased height?
I did not draft that piece, but I can't speak to that particular issue. But that's how it is, and that's how it was explained at the time.
But doesn't the state law explicitly grant an extra floor?
No.
No.
It does not.
No, it does for affordable projects. But what it says is, if you provide the requisite amount of affordable housing, you qualify for either incentives or concessions, which are extra height, FAR, setback relief, open space reduction, that addresses the affordable housing costs. That's a feasibility test.
Right.
In addition to waivers of development standards that may be necessary to physically accommodate the proposed project, inclusive of the density bonus and the incentives and concessions.
Right, but so to the city attorney's point, that height is not referenced as an extra floor is not referenced as an option in neighborhood commercial. Is it your position that state law would provide for that extra floor, whether or not the city references it?
Absolutely.
So I hate to stop this, but we are getting very far astray from what is actually on the agenda right now. So I understand that this is a very lively discussion, but this is not on the agenda this evening.
Okay, but thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah. So.
But I think, the sense of the commission is that we really want to pursue that, because it really is a low-hanging fruit. Dennis Zane.
I also don't think that's true about Main Street in Montana, that we allow affordable there.
If you'll give me a moment, I'll accommodate my age. Because otherwise I cannot share with you what we tried to send with you in a timely way. Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights agrees that the Planning Commission should recommend to the City Council amendments to the text of the LUCE, the Bergamot Area Plan, Downtown Plan, to modify the application process thresholds for 100% affordable housing projects. However, we object to amending the application process thresholds for all other housing projects compliant with HAA. We support finding ways to create permanently deed-restricted affordable housing to alleviate our affordable housing shortage, such as increasing thresholds to 75% units for 100% affordable housing projects. Modifying process thresholds would incentivize the production of market rate projects. For-profit rental units will unnecessarily drive up land prices, make it more difficult to produce affordable housing, and contribute to gentrification and rising rental costs overall. Now, this actually references indirectly the discussion you were just having about our RENA and our obligations with respect to market rate and affordable housing. What I would like to make a clearer point of is the question that Richard McKinnon asked, which had to do with our market rate production in the last RENA cycle and how it compares to what's expected of us in the sixth cycle. What we'll find if we see that is that we have done quite well on the market rate side, coming close now in the last cycle, if not exceeding what's expected in the future cycle, the ginormous cycle. It truly is that the challenge is before us to produce affordable housing. Now, there are some in the community who want to urge you just units, doesn't matter what they are. 9,000 units is 9,000 units. If you were to take a tack that tried to dramatically increase the development of market rate units, you would impair your ability to produce affordable units, except for the sliver that's inclusionary. And the sliver that's inclusionary, 20%, is nowhere close to the almost 70% that the RENA requires. But you would be driving up land costs. You would be having what I call the gentrification paradox, which is where market rate units induce demand, greater demand from higher income households to live in the same area, thereby producing demands for more market rate units. There is no affordability that shoots out the other end in a local community. There is no trickle down in that local respect. there may be imaginable, regionally speaking, 75 miles away, 25 years from now. But trickle down demand, supply and demand stuff doesn't happen very well in an 8 square mile community. We have seen that in our own community. We've had 10,000 units built in the last, 40 years. About 3,000 of them have been affordable. Those 7,000 units have not led to any decline in any kind of cost of housing in our community. In fact, housing costs now have, for vacancy decontrolled or market rate units, have grown leaps and bounds. The same is true in other parts of the region where, for example, in downtown Los Angeles, where there have been 35,000 some units produced, the effect there is rents have been rising, not falling anywhere. No unit, I would bet you, in downtown Los Angeles has had its rent reduced because of the enhanced supply. The gentrification paradox is that we are going to induce greater demand in those areas because of the higher level of services and the like that follow higher income households around.
Okay.
So
Is somebody timing? Not to make you the example.
I kept waiting for a ding.
I
but
know. I
didn't
don't
hear it,
think
so
there is a ping.
You give me a microphone and no ding, I'm
You
here.
just go on forever.
So please resist the temptation to suggest that simply increasing the supply is going to yield local affordability. We have to do that ourselves. We have to take strenuous efforts, and we have to press the state that if they're going to make these demands, they need to pony up. This is the single largest, unfunded mandate I think we have seen in our history.
Okay, I have one question, Denny. Did you know, you probably know that 38% of the affordable units produced since the passage of Prop R have been done by market rate developers?
I know that there have been about
38%.
38%. Mm-hmm. I'm going to check that.
Well, according to the last Prop R report.
I'm going to check that. There has been a share done, but I think it's less than that. It's
No, it's,
more like
well, look at the
25%.
Prop R report. It was actually before the Housing Commission in April, and that's where I got it.
I've been tracking those numbers and writing them down. I'll check it.
Okay. Thank you. Jason Islas.
Good evening. My name is Jason Islas. I'm speaking tonight as a resident in the Pico neighborhood. I'm in one of those awful trickle-down apartments, but it was built 50 years ago. And it doesn't have much amenities because it was built at a different market space, different time, and it's significantly less cheaper, in part because it doesn't come with a lot of parking, actually. It was built post-war in Santa Monica on what was undeveloped orchard land. That doesn't exist anymore. So I want to say I unambiguously 100% support the staff recommendation tonight, both for 100% affordable housing, but also for the housing that meets the AHP standards. And I don't think it goes far enough. It doesn't. 2010, we had the loose, and on paper it was a state-of-the-art document. We lost a lot of time downzoning the boulevards, lost a lot of time putting unrealistic, stringent requirements on projects in the downtown community plan, which have yielded not enough housing. When we put too much affordability requirements on it, it has the effect of being a backdoor height limit and suppressing development. So the truth is that short of lobbying for a robust investment in public housing, maybe from the state level, I think we have to be realistic with what we're working on the ground here. I think that the truth is, and Denny actually hinted at it, he's right, the effect won't happen for 25 years. But that's what courage and leadership is, planning for a future that you and I won't be living in, and planning for a future that meets the needs and of a generation that isn't here yet. I grew up in Santa Monica. I can barely afford to live here, and I don't qualify for affordable housing. I'm one of those people who went to college, first-generation college student, making more money than my parents did because they worked in grocery stores and hairdressers. They lived here back when Santa Monica was more affordable. I make more money. Should there not be a place for someone like me to move back to Santa Monica? I'm living in an apartment that should belong to someone who makes less money than me, but because we have not built more housing, we've made the existing stock, C grade, even D grade stock, inaccessible to people like my parents who were living here 30 years ago. And we have to look at ourselves. Are we really a progressive city when we continue to compromise with the forces of conservatism and reaction that fetishize the aesthetic of a small beach town that never existed? The reality is this has been an industrial and then a commercial region with jobs and resources, and we are betraying progressive values if we don't open up this community to more people.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Are there any questions? The next speaker is Carl Hansen, and then followed by Leonora Kamner.
Good evening, Commissioners. Carl Hansen, Housing Commissioner, but speaking tonight on my own behalf as a resident living on the edge of Wilmot in the downtown. First, I want to say, I'm highly supportive of process streamlining for both affordable housing and market rate housing. Especially with respect to 100% affordable housing, I fully agree with what Commissioner McKinnon was saying earlier. We need to make it as cheap, as fast, and as easy to build as many new affordable units as possible. And I would encourage you to look at everything in your purview to recommend that we reduce any impediments on the production of new affordable housing. Market rate is also incredibly important, and I think where I disagree with Mr. Zane's point earlier is if you don't fix the market shortage, the housing supply at market rates, you're hollowing out, as Commissioner Landers said earlier, our community. We're only going to have the ultra wealthy and the lucky that get in on subsidized deed restricted units. And that's not a good future for this community. I mean, I live in a rent controlled unit in Santa Monica. If I were to move out of that unit into an equivalent unit in my building, this is 8 years later, I'd be paying something like $600 more a month. And the reason is I'm competing with wealthy people that are moving into this city that are taking up the older units, like Mr. Isla said. And that's the true, that is one form of gentrification that happens absent development, is where do the wealthy people go that are looking to fill those jobs? They're going into the older stock. And that's why you need to build new market rate housing. That's why it's incredibly essential. I wanted to close real quick with a tweet that Barack Obama put out yesterday of a selection from a book from Connor Doherty. America has a housing crisis. The homeownership rate for young adults is at a multi-decade low, and about a quarter of renters send more than half of their income to the landlord. Homelessness is resurgent. Eviction displaces 1 million households a year, and about 4 million people spend at least 3 hours driving to and from work. Nowhere is this more evident than in California. It's true that the state is addressing facets of the mess with its efforts on rent control, subsidized housing, and homelessness, but the hardest remedy to implement, it turns out, is the most obvious: build more housing. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
So one of the worries that Denny raised in his comments was that moving HAA compliant projects to administrative approval would essentially open up market rate housing with relatively, from what I understood to be his perspective, relatively little return to the community in terms of affordability. You've made the case that we need to reset the housing shortage in order to help move toward greater economic diversity. But you also sit on the Housing Commission, and what I'm curious about is whether you've started talking about the HPP, because when we do these things, they work together.
Yes.
There's a process piece, and there's also an affordability, an inclusionary piece. And I'm wondering whether you see any opportunity if we move to AA streamlining for Tier 2 projects, HAA compliant Tier 2 projects, whether there is a better HPP formula that could actually help us get toward the economic diversity that you were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important thing for the Housing Commission to discuss. I think as Commissioner Lambert mentioned, the inclusionary elements has been important for the production of affordable housing in Santa Monica. I think as long as we get the percentages right, we should hopefully get a slew of new affordable housing through that process.
Okay. Have those conversations started to your knowledge?
I've had one meeting at the Housing Commission, and I have one tomorrow.
Okay.
But I look forward to more of those conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question, Carl.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you asked it because I wasn't frankly paying attention. Have you, I'm honest, have you, and I know you've only had one meeting, but do you plan to, at some point, discuss perhaps having moderate income being the major component of age? Did you ask that already? That's right. Okay. Sorry. That'll teach me.
We have not discussed that yet while I've been there, but I know that has been something that folks are interested in exploring.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
At least we're on the same brainwave.
Yeah, that's frightening. Leonora.
Hello, Leonora Kamner. I'm Managing Director of Abundant Housing LA. I'm also a resident of Santa Monica and a member of the Housing Commission. I just wanted to express my support for these proposed amendments, and especially that they apply to both 100% affordable housing projects and market rate projects. I think pitting affordable housing and market rate housing against each other is a false choice, and we need both of it. We need a lot more of both kinds of housing on a really, really major scale. And, I do want to see us meet our affordable housing RHNA target. It's going to be a massive amount of money. We're looking at like $215 million a year at least. And, because of Prop I, we can't even use all of that to finance. We can't even create our RHNA affordable housing obligations directly through that kind of financing anyway. So no matter how you look at it, market rate housing is going to have to be a part of the solution. We need to have solutions that address both affordable housing and market rate housing. And I do also, I think this is such a great and important step in the right direction. This is not going to be enough for us to start making things better here in terms of housing. Like we have to do this and then go farther and really start to turn around the housing situation here. We have a 50% rent burden rate. That's like 1 out of 2 renters here. Our levels of displacement are just, they're soaring. And, I'm Managing Director of Abundant Housing LA, but this is also just extremely personal for me. Like, I have to live here. My kids have to live here. I would just like to look them in the eyes and feel like there is going to be a better future here. Like, I would like to look at them and think they're going to live in a city where there isn't a 50% rent burden rate and their friends and neighbors are not being displaced and our unhoused neighbors are not dying on the street, and our carbon emissions are rising because we're displacing people into mega commutes. So I would like to be able to feel that for my children, and that's ultimately what I would like. So thank you all for hearing my comments.
What is Prop I? I thought I heard it for the first time today. Is that Article 34 stuff?
Yeah, it's apparently related to Article 34, but it's a proposition that we did in Santa Monica. I can't say the exact date of it, but it limits the amount of financing that we can do for affordable housing.
Really?
And it caps out at like what basically is like 220 units a year.
Are you serious?
Yes, and we've never actually met that cap because like honestly our creation of affordable housing hasn't been that high. But but if we're ever going to meet our RENA target, we would have to somehow repeal Prop I because like we're capped at 220 units.
But it's not really directly related to Article 34.
Apparently, it was a response to Article 34 that allowed us to do some kind of financing of affordable housing in the city, like as a way around Article 34. But I mean, I can't pretend that I fully understand why or how.
But is that to your understanding, and guest staff, can we get some more information on this at our next meeting? Is it for housing that the city pays for in full, or is it only if the city funds a portion of the housing?
My understanding is it's a dollar amount, so it's like the amount of financing. So I think I might have the number on my phone, but
Okay.
I'm sure like staff knows.
We'll get some more clarification.
Well, staff will report back to us.
I just want to ask a follow-up question following on what we were discussing with Commissioner Hanson. Do you think that if we move to AA streamlining for HAA compliant projects, that there is a better formula for HPP to encourage the production of moderate income units?
I mean, I'm interested also, like Commissioner Hanson, in exploring the AHPP using like moderate income units. I think that's like a very like interesting change that could potentially be beneficial. I mean, I also think we need to look at other sources of funding for affordable housing that don't just come from private development. I think that's like obviously going to be super important for like a massive amount of affordable housing, like 6,000 units. So, you know, I want to look beyond, like, I think the HPP obviously needs to be reworked. It needs to be better. It needs to be producing more housing, but like also we need new, maybe like more innovative types of housing funding as well.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you. Okay, the matter is now before the commission. Do you want to go down the line again? Mario, do you have a...
I would like to move that we approve the 100% affordable housing expediting to the staff report.
Do we want to bifurcate this? I'm in favor of both.
I would like to bifurcate it, but...
Is there a second, or how do we do this? Is there a second? There you go. Okay. Is there discussion? Or
yeah, I would like to open discussion. For, I mean, I'll move, since there wasn't the motion to bifurcate didn't move forward. I'll move the staff recommendation, but I have lots of additional stuff that I would like to add to it.
We should discuss first and then make
Okay.
motions.
Then let me raise some issues. I think that I support the staff recommendation, but there are a number of items specifically, particularly related to the HAA piece, that I believe need to be included in our recommendation to council. So I'd like to put those on the table if that's possible. And
why don't you do that before you make your motion?
Okay, so a couple of things. One is, I've always believed that if the Housing Accountability Act is driving the production of housing, it should be driving the production of housing and not the production of extended stay, hotel, or corporate housing. I recognize that the item that we're going to hear next is in discussion is focused on protections for existing rental housing, but if this is going to be moved forward as an IZO, I don't see any reason why the IZO could not include a requirement that...
This is it's an amendment to the loose.
Is this not being moved as an IZO?
No, so the commission doesn't, I mean, you're making a recommendation, obviously, to
Right.
council, but the commission's action is with respect to the plan amendments. We are bringing forward an urgency ordinance to the council, which, you know, will be informed by your recommendation.
Right,
tonight,
but
yeah.
couldn't, and is there a reason that the urgency ordinance could not include limitation on corporate housing and HAA compliant projects?
I think that you can state what you would like to accomplish tonight, and
Right.
the kind of as Heidi as whether it's in the IZO or in something else, I
Exactly.
think we just need to understand.
So that's item one.
I have a question, though, about
Yeah.
that. We say housing development project as defined by the Housing Accountability Act throughout all of this.
Right.
Isn't that sufficient? I mean, does that include short-term housing?
I don't think it clearly includes medium-term housing.
What's medium term?
Medium term is longer is 31.
Longer than short term.
31 to sort of 31 days to some period less than a year, which is what we discussed last time.
Okay,
It's
so we don't know if the HAA.
Right.
Can I
so-
run down the list and
No,
then
but
you can toss stuff
You
out?
may forget as you go down the list.
Okay. Do you want to? Okay. So yeah. So one is that if we're going to streamline Housing Accountability Act production, it ought to be for housing that is actually housing. That is number one. Number two, if we're going to streamline Housing Accountability Act production, it would be helpful, I believe, to ensure that there is consistency with our mobility plans. Those have been added as voluntary. We've added that to a number of DRs, but consistency with the bike action plan, consistency with the pedestrian action plan in particular. That's number two. Number three is we discussed the issue of variances and how to handle them, such as what happened with the frontage on 1828 Ocean. I would like to see staff have the leeway to resolve conflicts between existing standards that already appear in city standards. So if it's something like what happened at 1828 Ocean, where it was a building code issue up against, say, the ADA or the loose, that the staff would have the authority to resolve that without having to come to us. If it's a bigger issue, they absolutely should come to us. And finally, I would like to see a recommendation to council that this be paired with a substantial review of the AHPP. My preference would be to have something like, and I recognize there's a feasibility study underway, but we ought to move the wraparound service requirement that typically gets voluntarily attached to our DRs. That ought to move into the HPP as a whole, so that the provision of wraparound services becomes a function of the provision of inclusionary housing at the, say, 50% income level, AMI or below. But in fact, I think these AAs and Tier 2 projects really ought to focus on moderate income inclusionary production, for which you wouldn't need to provide wraparound services as a matter of course. Right. So those are the things that we've been doing over the last year to year and a half fairly consistently. We've been limiting or restricting medium-term housing. We've looked at the relationship with mobility. We've sort of said, of course you can have this variance, which is just a technical issue, and it makes the project look better, fairly typically. And we've asked for those wraparound services. Okay. So those are the four things. If I'm voting for this, it's on the sort of good faith that those recommendations would be carried to council.
Why don't you make a motion with those four items, and someone will second it, and they can add to it if they want.
Terrific. So that's my motion, is the staff recommendation with those four additional areas that I just outlined.
Is there a second? Second by Commissioner Reese.
Thank you.
Commissioner Fresco.
What Sean was just adding as recommendations kind of cuts to the core of exactly what I was talking about regarding the opacity of this ministerial process. And basically, we have done very small things to these applications as they come in, because there's not much we can do according to state law. But I think that those small things that we did actually did make projects better in very way. The four things that Sean listed. And what I would really like to make sure is that there is some publishing of what these projects are that goes through, that the applications, just the digital, the plans with whatever application form is submitted, go online together with that worksheet that staff does, the code compliance worksheet, the thing that they make anyway, so it's not like a staff report or anything like that. But it would just give the public an opportunity to see what was proposed and how it complied with the laws, so that moving forward, when these projects start to be built and some new fad comes along that is allowed by code but blocks a sidewalk in a funny way, or makes, a setback that is supposed to widen a sidewalk not that useful or something, so that people in neighborhoods can help us look out for more things like this that might evolve over time.
Is that an amendment you would like to make?
So, yes, I would like to suggest a
Friendly amendment.
a friendly amendment that would involve publishing applications and zoning conformance.
Is that
so
acceptable to the
it's
second?
available.
That's friendly.
You're it.
Is it friendly to you?
Yeah, I want to ask a question.
I have a question for her too, which
Okay.
is, it's actually a question for staff. Are projects required to hold community meetings? I know that the affordable housing providers do that as a matter of course, but is that a requirement for projects?
No. But they often do. I mean, Dave Rand did that with his project in Northeast Neighbors.
Well,
Right.
they won't now if there's no public.
Well, my question is whether I would go a step further, and I would even be willing to mandate at least one community meeting.
I think that would go against the
Too
whole
far?
purpose of
Okay.
what we're doing.
All right, well, then it's friendly as you offer.
There's no end, Sean, there's no end game. I mean, the public has no
Right.
control over the project, so.
Right, it wouldn't give the public an opportunity to comment on the project because they can't change anything anyway.
change anything.
What it does is it's going to help us monitor how well our zoning code is regulating the way projects come out.
Commissioner Pastor? Oh, Commissioner Reese, sorry.
So, I mean, I like I like the concept of we're being transparent about the application coming in. What my concern is nobody's going to pay attention to it. And as with, even now we do noticings to people in 100 feet or 1,000 feet around a site, 500 feet, whatever it happens to be. And it never fails that people show up at the hearing and say, well, they'll be holding the hearing notice. Like, I had no notice of this hearing. Which is one of my favorites. But to me, I like the idea of having that out there, but I'm not sure that just putting it up there is going to be as helpful as maybe saying that there has to be a mailing to the people in around the site, saying this information is available to you.
I mean, I don't want to add burdens
Right.
to a process that we're unburdening. What I want to do is, when a neighborhood says, oh my God, have you at a community meeting, they say, you notice there have been 5 buildings come up and they all put a planter in front of the door and you can never figure out where the entrance is to those buildings.
And what are they going to do about that?
Well, then they'll call the city and say, how come and the city will say, well, these are the projects and this is how and it'll give them a tool to understand our code, and then they can come to the planning commission.
Commissioner
and
Pastor, do
say,
you have a comment?
Make them stop putting planters in front of the door.
This just all seems like it's creating more burden on staff, which to me is part of the issue, is that projects are slow because there's not enough staff time. And I really do appreciate the trying to make it more transparent, but I'm concerned that putting more burden on staff is problematic.
Not documents they're not creating anyway. It's just posting.
Well, that's a question. I mean, but then
What do you think?
I guess it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Because as a wise man once said, you can't have it both ways, but I think there is something here in which what we're saying is we want to streamline the approval process, but we want to make sure that the public is aware of what's happening so that people can't say, I wasn't told, or, oh my God, this building is popping up. Now, for the time being, at least, these projects are still going to go to the ARB in general.
They are,
Right.
forever.
So there will be a curbed article or an LAist article or
There's
some.
a notice, isn't there a public
Right.
notice for
And there's a
ARB?
public notice for ARB, so there will be some public awareness, but I want to actually make a different suggestion, which is that the administrative approval document and again, these are just recommendations from us to council,
Right.
that there, and I don't, maybe this question already exists, but there be a question to the applicant, please describe the community outreach that you have conducted. So that,
Again,
that
that's
the applicant is at
creating
least
burden.
thinking, it's not a burden on staff, it's a burden on the applicant, that they're already getting the win for the streamlined approval, but they're being told that they're going to be held accountable for the engagement with the public. I mean,
Just as we don't have the right to change anything about
Let
their
me,
project,
I have
neither
something
does
to
the
add.
public. And,
Nina and I talked about this afternoon, and the intent is wonderful. I mean, everybody's for transparency and opaqueness and what have you. But if the public doesn't like a project, there's absolutely no recourse whatsoever.
But what I'm saying is that if we start seeing patterns
Of not liking projects, we do that all the
No,
time.
patterns of new features or trends or applications or interpretations of code that lead to features that are impacting neighborhoods, we should,
I guess my concern, and something we talked about, is, and I hate to say this, there's some people in this community who don't want to see things built.
I don't want to ever hear you
And-
say
and
that. We
that's-
want to hear what everybody says. to
Well,
say.
we have been hearing that for 20 years.
And we
And
should
I
be
think, and I really
continuing to
think
hear it.
that we need to give people a reality check that we have 9,000 units to produce, and there's only so much.
And they need to start thinking about them differently, just as we're thinking about them differently. We're no longer thinking about the fine-grained project by project. We're thinking about the way the whole program is structured. Now, we are relying completely on the brilliance of our zoning ordinance. And problems with that are going to start to emerge, and everybody needs to start thinking about it that way.
Well, the
Let me
folks
ask-
that
wait,
I'm talking about are the ones who are responsible, in my opinion, for the 2015 downzoning, and that's where we are. So-
I have a
Well,
question
that's-
for
Commissioner
staff.
Pastor.
Neither here nor there.
I have a question for staff, and then I have some comments on the other 4 points. So I don't know if that's the appropriate time. Well, but, so staff, do you hear from people? So what I hear Commissioner Fresco is concerned about is if there are patterns of things, you know, and liking it to this medium-term rental thing, do you hear about them? So do you think that you would hear about them anyway? And is this attempt at transparency, do you think that is going to help?
I think, yes, we do hear about them. You know, in a situation like this where we move, you know, if we move towards an AA, and I just want to clarify, when you're making your comments, I'm not sure if we're talking about the 100% affordable or the HA compliant or both.
I was
or-
talking,
So I wasn't sure.
All
'cause-
projects is
All
what I'm
projects,
talking
got it.
about.
Okay, so, I mean, eventually we do hear about them, you know, if people see activity happening on the site. For ARB meetings, the site actually has to be posted, which may be the first time people see that. We require posting of the site when a demolition permit is proposed, and for development review permits. It is not required for administrative approvals currently. And like I said, for the ARB application, when that's submitted, your site has to be posted. So, you know, I would say that that's probably the most effective way. The hearing notices get to some people, but I think most people who are immediately impacted, you know, by the development see it because they walk by the site. So.
Commissioner Landris.
So, the reason that I was leaning into your suggestion was really I was reflecting on the project that was on Sentinella and Wilshire that came to us last year. The developer came in with a good idea, with an HAA compliant idea, but without the awareness of the lived experience of the people on Sentinella who needed to get in and out for work. And they were able to work with the developer to change the circulation pattern so that there was a better entry and egress from that project. Didn't reduce the number of units. It didn't do anything that the HAA would have prevented us from doing. But that requirement that there was some public notice led to a community engagement. Candidly, I mean, I'm not interested in giving a bigger platform to the people who just want to stand up and yell no.
Exactly.
But I am very interested in giving some opportunity to the people who say, look, I live here, this is how we move around, this is what our situation is. I need to be able to know that this applicant is going to be in communication with the neighborhood in order to talk about this. And frankly, staff doesn't always know the details of those issues on a day-to-day basis.
So, but would that come up at ARB?
I'm not sure.
No,
See, I think, let me,
You can't,
Jim, go
yeah.
ahead.
Well, yeah, you can't change that at ARB. I mean, I think we're setting up a situation where the community could know about a project, be upset about the project, and have no leverage over changing it. I think somebody's already mentioned that.
Same as us.
Right, so we're in the same, well, I don't know. We might have some control over driveway locations, but in the DRP. But, so I'm nervous about that. I do kind of like the idea of making sure that people are aware of the project. And again, to me, I was thinking of one mailing saying, hey, this application was filed, done by the applicant, and they do a certificate back to the city saying it was done. But then again, what is that really going to do? Maybe what it does is it allows the community to yell at that applicant a little bit more, now have a direct contact with them. But
Well, that's why I see it as a database. I mean, maybe it just comes from my own nerdy approach to the world, but when I see something seems to not be going a certain way, I want to see all the ways that what is being interpreted. It gives people who want to a way to understand why that problem is and
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi?
problem solve.
Yeah, I have a very different view of this. First of all, let me start out by saying no project is perfect. The more people look at it, the more they understand it, they more anticipate the problems. Maybe they have illusions, maybe they see all the wrong things. But there is a value of a collective look, a collective seeing of the project. And even though we as a group, when a project is fully conforming, have, quote, no control, we provide that forum where a lot of things that can be discussed that maybe aren't embedded in our code, because if they were embedded in our code, it would be 18 volumes. It would be like, the tax code. There's a lot of nuances, and I'll just use an example of the location of a driveway. Doesn't affect height, but it could be moved. And who would better know that? No one here would know who knows the most things about this project. We cannot rely on the developer's infinite wisdom to show up and have a perfect project. We need a little more, let's say, group thinking and poking at it to see, does it work here, does it work there? And I'm speaking as an architect, and we know we're perfect in our designs. So the point is that there isn't value to a group process. I know the intent is good to run it through, let's say, it's online, you can look up the plans and all that, but there's nothing like having a group discussion here where we look at it. So that's the first thing I would like to point out. The second thing I would like to point out is something that Commissioner Launders was referring to, where we had this small problem on 1880 Ocean, and that kicked them over into the let's say, by right situation. But that's not the right lesson of that project. The right lesson of that project is because they were not in the totally conforming box, they had to try a little harder, and they moved that whole building back 5 feet and made a better streetscape for us. So we traded a small variance over a height issue of a floor for a big improvement in mass in the project. So what I'm saying is I'm not so convinced that we need to rush to judgment and say, just take the hands off the steering wheel, we have nothing to add. We have a lot of things to add. We're always adding something. And it's important for the developers to hear that, to hear what our thinking is, even though it's, quote, not in the code. But I would like to give the 100% affordable housing projects the fastest lane on the freeway. Right. Let them go screaming through and give them an advantage, because they're, in a sense, bidding against all these market rate developers, and they're always going to be crushed by the profit motive. They're not going to be able to have the money to compete with them. So we have to level the track for them. But I don't think it's a big problem for a developer to come in here and present their project where everyone can talk about it and anyone hear the common discussion, as opposed to everybody having a discussion in the...
Okay, let me tell you my perspective. I did some research in the past couple of days, and what I found was that the average time to get through the development review process is 1 to 3 years. 1 year if things go really well, 3 years if you have a complicated project like the Ocean Avenue one and they decide to do an EIR. It takes 3 years. Since the passage of the inclusionary program in downtown, construction costs have gone up by 30%. So that time it's taking to be before us means construction costs are going way up, holding costs, it's costing much more to build housing than it should. And that compared to the marginal impact we have on any one of these projects is ridiculous. I mean, and the more it costs to build housing, the less affordable units you're going to get when you actually do the analysis. So our marginally useful involvement through the DRP process is not worth the cost of that housing project and fewer affordable units than we could otherwise get.
And can I add something to that, which is that I find voluntary conditions disturbing, frankly, and I don't think that we should be in the business of saying there have to be voluntary conditions, because they're not really voluntary, okay? And I think it puts us in a very dangerous position as a city, and it has a liability. So I don't want to, so to have this marginal discussion, as Commissioner Lambert said, and then we start imposing voluntary conditions, I can't abide by that. Can we talk about your 4 things?
Yes, can I
Can I ask some clarification questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I wanted to.
So for medium-term housing, do we actually have a definition for medium-term housing, or are you suggesting that as part of this motion that the council would adopt a medium-term housing, and how is that going to be enforced?
So we have a corporate housing definition.
Right.
Staff has been working on a new definition for medium-term housing as a replacement term that would incorporate corporate housing but refer to other forms of non-intended permanent residence.
So,
Council has given direction to protect rent-controlled properties, and the next item will give us some language. I would like to see as much of that language as possible or appropriate incorporated by Council into the zoning ordinance for the purpose of new production. Council has already said that it believes that this is a commercial use, not a residential one.
I don't have any problem with the bike action plan PED consistency. For the variances, my suggestion is, could there be a percentage, like if it's within 10%, staff has the authority to make that determination.
10% of what?
Well, if you're asking, if your height, it's a code, whatever the code requirement is.
Okay.
Or a mod, well, what would you do with the mod? In other words, what would you do with the street height issue that happened, which is very rare because it was a corner and there was debate about the frontage.
If your setback has to be 10 feet and you want a setback of 8 feet, that's not 10%. So maybe it's 20%, right? You have to, I mean, we have to give staff some kind of, I think, guidelines of what that discretion is what I'm suggesting.
Okay.
And I'm not exactly sure what the right number is.
I think staff wants to work out what discretion it wants,
fine.
and I'd like to recommend that it be given discretion and let it work its way through the staff process.
That's fine. Okay. And then with the wraparound services, are you suggesting that for any density bonus project with any affordable units?
No.
Or is that for how many units? That's my concern.
What we have done in the past is that on the DRs, we get the voluntary commitment in the project description and in the STOA it just sits in the description that before they open before they open up, they're going to provide this concierge services of case management and or support services to the residents of the subsidized units.
But is that you may have a project that may only have 1 or 2 subsidized units or 5 subsidized units.
And that's why that requirement is there, because the idea is that if you live in a CCSM building, those services are provided as a matter of course to everybody who lives there. If you're one of 1 or 2 or 3 extremely low income units, and I think that's what drove this voluntary offer, is that you have these DRs with 3 extremely low units or 4 extremely low units. Those folks need a pathway to the services. I would like to move that concept out of the land use, out of the land use process and attach it rather to the AHPP so that the provision of those referral services becomes a function of our inclusionary housing program, not a function of our land use approval process. It's doing the kind of cleanup that you would like to do, I think.
Okay.
Because
So
it attaches
so
it.
it's not, okay, so if it's in the AHHP, I am just concerned about having non-affordable developers be responsible for that, because frankly, I'm not sure they're very good at it.
We've been doing it for
No,
years.
I know we have,
Yeah.
and I'm raising
Well,
questions about it.
And in fact,
And so if it gets moved into the AHHP, which is, I hear you that it is a better place to have it, I would like there to be some, I'd like it to come back to us and have more limitations as to what that really looks like.
Well,
Because again, I'm worried about non-affordable housing developers providing services they're not qualified to provide.
right. Well, in my fantasy world, which hopefully we get to, the DRs up to these number of units would, instead of having like a 5% or 7.5% very low requirement, providing these 4 units on 50-unit projects, right? I would like to see a 50-unit project have a 10% moderate requirement, which immediately eliminates the need for the wraparound services and creates the moderate units that we need, because we're not delivering them under even the current RENA. And we say to the private developer, tax credit financing or not, it's your problem. Just, you're getting streamlined. Deliver us 10% moderate. And then we do the low and very low and extremely low at higher on much bigger projects.
I understand, yes, that I understand, and I'm sorry if I am just not understanding or if I'm dense about this, but given that, I don't exactly understand how it fits within this motion, which is cleanups to the loose as to the opposed to just the, I guess I'm not understanding.
It fits within the motion because these are things that over the last number of years, we have traditionally added to DRs.
Right.
One way or another. And what I'm saying is, as part of our recommendation to council, if they're going to move to a streamlined HAA compliant approval process, this is how we recommend that they address each of these 4 issues that the Planning Commission has traditionally taken on. And to Commissioner, if I can just say, to Commissioner Fonda Bernardi's point, you're right. In an ideal world, in a world that doesn't have a housing crisis, more eyes on a project is absolutely better. I agree. But I think at this moment in time and history, we are not in a position to demand that level of scrutiny on every single project. And we've invested so much community time in our loose and our bike and ped and net zero energy and other plans, sustainability, that staff has extraordinary public input and direction from our elected officials that will inform the review of the project. If we get to a place where we somehow come out of this housing crisis, maybe we want to take another look at how we review housing. But I just don't think this is the moment to be insisting on more eyes on every project, on every 50 or 60 unit project where we all go, yep, looks good, and we move on.
Whoa, time out. I never said that it was friendly, because I still don't understand exactly what we're suggesting. Right? No, I understand it was to have, we talked about a lot of things, and so the only thing in the end you're talking about is that the zoning conformance sheet that city planning does when they take in the application then becomes something on a website that somebody can go check.
After it's approved.
No.
When it's,
It can be after it's approved. It's basically an academic provision. They can, I don't really care about that. What I want is for that information to be available so that people can look it up and find out what happened.
fine. That's
It's
friendly.
a posting of the determination, basically, so
Right.
that the project's approved, it's
And also
signed
the
off.
plan,
But I think
the
it's-
application.
Yeah.
But wait a second, because what I heard you was a checklist of zoning conformance and an
Well,
LOD or a statement of overriding, I'm sorry, what do we call them here, a STOA? That doesn't have zoning conformance as much on it, does it? Or is it just
No, so for the administrative approval determinations, it's basically a table.
Okay.
That shows like how you comply with code, so that is a determination.
Okay. So that's fine.
I've seen that form.
Okay, I'm fine with that, but I'm going to tell you that I'm having second thoughts about a couple of the other things that I've seconded. One of them is the variance, And I understand if it's minor, but what's a minor variance? It's a variance is a variance, and I think the whole point of this was when they bring up DRP projects to us that are completely consistent with the zoning. So that to me, I'm not really comfortable with that portion of it anymore. And let me just get my other issue out is this AAR, the wraparound services. I'm going to tell you, when I first got on the commission, I started hearing you doing that. I was like, this doesn't make sense to me, and I don't really like it. But now that I start thinking about some of these TOC projects I'm working on in LA, for example, I have a 490 unit project, and my client's going to have 49 ELI units in there. They need that kind of service. So I think it's really, I really appreciate that now. But I think that shouldn't be part of this motion. I think we should make a separate recommendation to City Council that they request that amendment to the AAHP.
I think he is, that's what I'm getting at.
Okay, my understanding of my motion was that my motion was the staff report plus those 4 recommendations, as recommendations. Because none of those go into the red line. So the staff recommendation is the red line, and now we have 5 additional considerations for council to accompany the red line, which was what I thought my motion was.
Okay, but it's not, it's address, the AHP is address, I mean, we're addressing.
Do you want to take it? I mean, we can handle it separately. I don't mind.
So I want to get to the same place you are, I just think of.
You want to go down this? Sure, okay.
So now that I've just rocked the boat a little bit, because I don't want to support this one with the variance.
Can we talk about that?
Sure,
well,
absolutely.
Because I had a couple of conversations with staff about the variance issue, and I want to see if there's a way, because my understanding was that staff is also reticent to have this vague notion of discretion, and the very specific case that we talked about was when there were when, say, the building code and the loose were doing a little bit of this, where we're going back and forth, right? Where staff actually had something and two conflicting objective standards where they could have the discretion to resolve it. Not where there was something where we were actually going to have to exercise some, something make soup.
Might I suggest that also is a separate motion?
Sure.
Or a separate, it's not exactly part of the streamlining, and that maybe there needs to be a little bit more thought given to, well, when do we want to give staff that discretion?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, let me just add my thoughts about the variance, and the poster child for that you brought up was 1828 Ocean, which was a far superior project with a variance. They could easily have come in without the variance, and it would have been an ADA issue and da-da-da-da-da, but it would have been code compliant and would have been fine. But it would have been an inferior project to what it was with a variance. My anticipation is that if we don't do something about the variance process, we're going to see projects that would be better with a variance, but to get the AA stuff, they're not going to go for it. So we're going to get projects that are not as well designed because they don't want to go for a variance.
Which is why we should think about what that variance is, and then give staff that authority, but as a separate thing to then what we're talking about.
Can I just provide some context to that as well? I mean, you're bringing up a particular example of a project, and that was a very unique set of circumstances. We do not see that happen very often. On projects like that, we attempted to address the ground floor issue because we were seeing that repetitively. That was a unique set of circumstances with a slope and what have you. So, I don't think that's going to be a thing, an issue we're going to see over and over and over again. Our standards in the code are written for 98, 99% of projects on flat property. There's always going to be an exception that we can't possibly anticipate every single time. And that's what the modification and variance process is for.
So to restate my motion for clarity, it is the staff recommendation plus the intended permanent the restriction on medium-term housing, the consistency with the bike and ped action plans, and I would probably throw in the sustainability plan for good measure, if that's friendly to the seconder. And the third item that we're keeping is we're taking out, well, the third item we're keeping is Commissioner Fresco's requirement that the determination and the plans be posted.
That's fine.
And is your recommendation for both 100% affordable and Tier 2, or just Tier 2?
100% affordable doesn't do medium-term rentals.
Good point.
And for the other two, I would apply to both. Yeah. For the sake of transparency. Yeah. The consistency with the plan, the consistency with existing plans, and
So I just want to make clear, and this is something that I think Commissioner Landers did make clear, but these would be issues that would be forwarded to council and not necessarily something we can incorporate into the IZO that's going to be presented on March 10th. And it would be recommendations to the city council for consideration on whether or not they want to adopt the IZO or, you know, just to make clear, because these could, we need to look into how to integrate them into the code. Can we integrate them into the code? All of those issues. So I just want to make clear that this is not necessarily all that quick.
which is why the second, if once we do this, then I'll come back with the other motion, and if I can put the two together, because they're unrelated to this, but
And
is that
You're
okay?
taking the AHPP out, right?
Yeah,
Right.
and the variance issue.
And the medium-term housing issue, we have always intended for that to be a generally applicable rule, so I'm not sure that we would bifurcate it only, I'm not sure that we can, so we
Right.
would have to look into that,
What is
bifurcate
that?
it and only have it applicable to. There is no, we would be implementing a new law related to, or extending it, there'd be many ways of looking at it, but anyway, the point is, the medium-term housing, just having it apply to this classification of housing is probably not something.
No, then I'm happy to apply it to the whole
Yeah.
thing, yeah.
I actually have,
I mean, not for purposes of this IZO, it would be just when we make the
Yeah.
law applicable to all housing.
All production.
Yeah.
okay, I had actually a couple of questions of staff that we never got to. I'm not sure that we missed that part or we did it at all. And what were they? There's one kind of technical issue, and I discussed it with Tara this afternoon, but she said she had talked to you and she felt okay with it, and that is if we give the height bonus to 100% projects, that obviously increases the height. But in the law, there's an FAR max. So technically, and which is going to be higher with more floors, technically they're out of compliance with the objective standards of the code.
Yes, no, you're talking in the context of density bonus. It doesn't apply. Like, basically, the state density bonus law says that you can go beyond the code.
Okay, so the FAR that applies to that site doesn't
It doesn't
count?
apply because, if they're pursuing a project that is within a half mile of a major transit stop, it's unlided density.
So
it
the
does-
FAR goes out the window?
It doesn't matter what the city's FAR is, yeah.
Okay, the other question I had, I don't remember. And we have accounted for the fact, didn't state law change when an application is deemed complete, the definition of that?
Talking about SB 330?
I can't remember what I'm talking about. But
So, yeah, there is a difference. So that's for applicants that choose to avail themselves of that process. There is a very different processing procedures for projects that choose to go
Okay.
down in SB 330.
So we're okay with the language in here?
Yeah, yeah.
There's a contradiction, and maybe it's just a typo. On page 11 and page 13, they don't comport. It's about the downtown, the DCP on Lincoln Boulevard, the east side and the west side. The east side, as I recall, the page of the red line. Where is it? One page says that it is 50 feet on the east side of Lincoln, and the other thing says it's 40. Where did I find that? Page 13. Page 13?
Yeah, but they're different, it's different height and FAR is entirely.
They are, but they're the same area.
Yeah, we did, remember.
No, I know, but it says west side and east side.
Yeah, west side and east side has different height.
I know that, but one thing I found had the east side at 40 feet when it's actually 50 feet, right?
I mean, we'll take a look at it. I'm not sure where.
Yeah, I'm pretty
okay.
sure that, I just can't find it right now.
The bucket 3.77 issue.
Okay, so where are we? Your motion you've stated it.
I have stated it.
Okay,
Yes.
so shall we take a roll call vote?
Yes.
Hello?
Sorry, just to clarify, so the issue that you're seeing, it's not wrong, it's the difference between a residential project and a non-residential project.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So there is remember the DCP has
Yes,
that variance
yes,
between,
yes,
it
I
favors
do.
housing,
I
right?
do remember that.
So it's lower.
Okay.
Sorry, just, so roll call? Okay.
So roll call.
Yeah, Commissioner Fonda Bernardi,
No.
Commissioner Fresco. That was a yes?
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Landris?
Yes.
Commissioner Pastor?
Yes.
Commissioner Reese?
Yes.
And Chair Lambert?
Yes.
So may I now make my second motion, which is unrelated to the, which is technically unrelated to the text amendment, but of course entirely related to the text amendment, which is that we ask council to incorporate the case management and/or support service consideration for inclusionary housing into the AHPP, so that the provision of those services is tied to the AHPP requirement for a given project, and that we ask staff to look into how it might address variances so as to ensure the best possible projects.
Second, did you second? I have a question too about the wraparound. I've always indulged you by supporting you.
Just following Amy, so.
I know. I've always sort of doubted whether it really makes sense for 2 or 3 tenants in a building. And it's undefined. We don't really know what it means. I think we heard once from the housing division that they had whatever it is we were looking for, but I'm not even sure that's true. So I think for one thing, it comes out of the housing commission, not the city council. So I don't know if the city council is going to ask the housing commission to do that. Is that?
Well, the core point that I'm making is that we've been doing this in land use.
I know,
approvals,
I understand.
and that it should be a function of the inclusionary, and that if council wants to solve that issue in a different way that we haven't thought of, I think that's great. I think the issue is, to Commissioner Reese's point, when you have people at the 30 or even sometimes at the 50% income level, and they're just a handful of units within a project,
Right.
They don't have the pathway to services, and they somehow need it.
No, I understand all
That's-
that. The question is
that's all I'm saying.
what
is
it
that
means.
I want to
Okay.
preserve that because it's been part of the DRP process.
I understand.
I'm simply
I get it.
suggesting that it
I
be
understand.
solved differently.
So there's a housing commissioner here, and he heard you. So,
I got jazz hands.
Commissioner Reese?
Should we refine your motion to say that it should be implemented in the AHP and defined?
Yes,
that'd be good.
implemented and defined in the AHPP, yeah.
And clearly, it's income group specific, so moderate income doesn't need this.
I don't think it does, but I actually wouldn't want to preclude the housing commission or the council from having the conversation about who needs these service, who needs it, and letting them arrive at whatever conclusion they want. Again, it should be part of the inclusionary process, not the land use process. Yeah.
Did you second?
I did.
Okay, so roll call vote?
Voice vote, probably a voice vote.
Really? Voice vote? Okay, so all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Abstain? Did that include the variance stuff? Okay, wow, it's only 10:15. I know. What? We don't have this is the Sean show. Okay.
Medium-term housing item.
So this item, as you can see, or as we explained, it was withdrawn at the request of staff, item 6B. So item 7 is a discussion on clarifying the use regulations for residential types. This is born from Council's direction from their September 10th, 2019 study session on new housing models. Council gave us direction with respect to how to proceed on this, and as you saw me indicate in the presentation, it is a 2-phase approach. The council asked us to bring back as soon as we could changes to the code to ensure that clarifications actually consistent with actions that the Rent Control Board has taken that existing housing stock is for natural persons as their permanent place of residence, and that there be a minimum 1-year lease for housing units. So the reason we pulled it from the agenda is that in looking at doing this in the zoning code, it became clear to us that when you look at the way the use classifications for residential are structured, there's a lot of restructuring, I think, that needs to happen within that whole section. And it was really more than, it wasn't really a quick thing. A surgical thing is what we're trying to do in this phase of our work plan. We are still moving forward, however, with the regulatory ordinance. The changes in the zoning ordinance were always sort of sister provisions. If this is really more of I would say, an enforcement issue, and it's more effective in other parts of the municipal code. So we are still moving forward on March 10th to bring these changes, these clarifications in Articles 4 and 6, right, of the municipal code. So that's like the rent control law, and then Article 6 is the regulatory ordinance for multi-unit housing. So, those 3 changes are what are going to be brought forward. So the zoning changes are not before you at this time. It's just open for discussion tonight in terms of, the clarifications we're bringing forward. The zoning changes are really going to be part of that broader work plan to talk about medium-term housing and new housing models and what form that takes, how we define it. Right now, there's no definition of that, how, whether we have any use classification or how we sort of put parameters around what that use is.
So the 3
prior. Yeah, so it's the natural persons, leasing to natural persons only, that it is for your permanent place of residence, and that there's a minimum 1-year lease.
Okay.
So those are the 3 things that are going to be brought forward to the council to clarify the use of existing housing stock.
Are there any questions for?
Yeah, I'd like to ask questions about the 1-year lease. I mean, the first 2 make a lot of sense, but the 1-year lease seems, I don't know, onerous. I mean, what does the 1-year lease get us?
That's a requirement. The Rent Control Board has been asking for that for some time, and this is part of council's.
I guess I'm just asking, what are they getting for that?
They gain permanent residence. The idea, as I understand it, and I just want to give credit to former Commissioner Jen Kennedy and Rent Control Board Commissioner Anastasia Foster, they have observed, and staff has observed, issues in rent-controlled buildings in existing stock where the buildings have been sort of chopped up both physically and temporally, and have been converted to medium-term corporate housing. And essentially those units are technically still under rent control, but they've been lost to the rent control market because of how those units are being rented out. And so the protection for existing stock, and this is what the current ordinance is talking about, which is why I raised production earlier, is intended to ensure that rent-controlled units are really going to people who are intending to stay, and the way that you sort of document that is that they sign a 1-year lease. There was some discussion at council in December, I remember, where council members said, well, what if the person signs a 1-year lease and then they have a reason that they have to go, or how do we support people who are, students, or what are those issues? And council asked staff to go back and think about it, essentially, look at what those different uses were, and come back. And my understanding is that the consensus was that in our rent-controlled stock, that the 1-year minimum was a needed protection, and that in other stock there was a longer conversation to be had. We've seen different co-living models. For example, there's one that a few of us went out to visit called Treehouse, where they're actually requiring a 1-year commitment from even their co-living tenants as a function of ensuring that the people who live there want to be there.
Okay, but I don't know that I still heard an answer on why the 1 year helps.
Because it's the intention to live here permanently, which is activated through that.
Is this like some really unusual requirement? I mean, you know, in all of my renting years, which were granted a long time ago, a one-year lease and then month to month after the first year was a really common thing. I remember in New York being required to sign 2-year leases. And all the college students I know sign year leases, and they stop coming home for the summer when they move into an apartment. And
Well,
that's just, I don't see it as a big problem. It just seems really obvious to me.
Okay, well, as a current landlord, I mean, and I have one unit, and that's my.
I have
that's
one
my,
unit, too.
Okay, so I have a very small experience with this, but I think in the 20 years I've had it, I've always signed 6-month leases, and I don't think I've ever had a tenant last or be there less than 5 years. But I always thought that the 6-month lease kind of gave them and us, my family, kind of time to figure out whether we were compatible together. And now all of a sudden, you know, I just am not seeing the value in that extra 6 months in there.
So bear in mind,
or why the government
Commissioner
has to
Hester.
be in that business.
Can I add something to that? If you notice in the last rent control law that was passed by the state, the benefits transfer, they travel if you've been there for 1 year. The benefits of having your rent increase limited to 5% plus inflation only lock in after 1 year. And we live in a vacancy decontrol environment. So if you have rents that are going up every 6 months, like in your case, you would have a much higher rent increase over time. Then it's a way of flattening the rent increase curve, even though in your particular case you might not be exploiting your tenant, you might be doing them a service. In the overall scheme of things, there are more scummy landlords than there are landlords that are considering the needs of tenants.
I'm still unclear as to whether what you're taking to council is for all units or just rent-controlled units.
So
It's for both?
It's for both, yeah. It's for rent control units and for, council directed, you know, certain provisions for a focus on rent-controlled housing, but also existing housing stock. So I think we are, you know, I think I'm hearing the questions here, and those were the precise questions actually that council and staff was grappling with, and, you know, the extent to which the city can reach into that tenant-landlord relationship, and, you know, how you implement this 1-year lease. We've done a lot of research with cities. I think, you know, we have some thoughts as to how to accomplish that. You know, recognizing a situation like Commissioner Reese is talking about, you know, where people, you can't force someone to sign a lease they don't want to sign, right? If they don't want to stay there, then you can't say, oh, you have to. You know, so I think that's what we're working to, you know, through in the language of how you accommodate council's objective, but also the realities of, you know, what happens in these transactions.
And how are we going to enforce it?
That's part of the issues we're exploring.
And is it, I assume the city attorney's found it is legal to enact this provision?
Yeah.
It is.
Right, so we've looked at models from other jurisdictions, and we're currently evaluating these options, and we'll be, you know, making our recommendation on enforceability and legality and all of that. Yeah, we've been working very closely with staff on this one, because it is, it implicates many different issues, and so we're trying to work through all of those.
So West Hollywood, for example, only allows rentals of ADUs with a minimum 1-year lease term. You can't otherwise rent out your ADU.
So are we being asked to take any action today, or is this just an informational item?
You are not being asked to take action. We just wanted to provide the opportunity for the commission to hear what was happening. So because the item got pulled, we wanted to have the opportunity for you to at least hear what was happening and talk about it.
Can I ask a follow-up, which is council, and this relates to, say, medical support housing, student housing, some function of corporate housing that is actually needed in Santa Monica because we have corporate activity here, and so there's some need, although it's not as great as, you know, some people might want it to be. Where are you headed in the sort of notion of commercial use versus residential use on the housing in this vague area?
Yeah, we haven't landed,
You haven't landed.
on that.
Okay.
That is part of the broader work program. it's not a simple issue, at all. And I think in trying to define what it is, how we define it, is it a zoning issue or does it live somewhere else? These are questions to sort of grapple with.
And in the old, well, the currently valid corporate housing definition, there's some long discussion of amenities and furnishings, and I think even VCRs are referenced in the code. If anybody remembers what those are. Have you landed anywhere related to furnishings?
No, I mean, other than we're aware that the definition of corporate housing is very specific. It has certainly impacted enforceability, of it. And so, that's part of the issue. What are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to regulate? And I think, council's direction on September 10th was actually, they had a very good discussion. I think we actually got quite clear direction on where to go with this, which was number one, address the issues that we're seeing right now in terms of the conversion and loss of rent control units for this purpose in ways that were never intended for what was intended to be permanent housing stock. And then secondly, council asked us to explore the feasibility of this kind of housing, however, whatever it is, whether it's medium term, however it's defined, and then bring it back and how it integrates into the housing that we do allow. So that's what we're
Thanks.
asking.
So I mean, personally, I just would indicate my personal strong support for the direction that you're moving in, and appreciate you bringing it back.
Commissioner Pastor.
Sorry, just one last comment. As someone who has been displaced from their home due to fire, I would make a suggestion that there be a provision, that there be some kind of exception for people in that situation.
Emergency housing
for
kind of
emergency
situations.
housing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've always sort of had the position, I would be willing to be more lenient on this because it would take the pressure off the existing rent control stock that's being converted to short-term housing.
I would like to move the recommendation that we've discussed.
Second.
Okay. Roll call, not roll call, voice vote. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And opposed? Abstain? Okay, that brings us to the end. That sounds ominous, doesn't it? No, they're all gone. The only ones left, Catherine's here. So we are hereby adjourned. And thank you very much, staff. This was a great session. Huh?
Well, that's what I was concerned.
Yeah, that's not a good thing.
I feel condescending myself. Plus, I'm afraid to be Jewish and outdoors at this point with Donald Trump in charge. I feel like everything is just going to shit.
What's happening? You hear what's happening at the debates tonight? What's happening? Listen, we might actually get a Jewish president.
God forbid.
It'll be a breakthrough for America.
It's not a religion.
Would you? Oh, that's another